The cold had become a living thing. It crawled beneath the ghillie veil like something hungry, wrapping itself around Staff Sergeant Sarah Morgan's bones with the patience of a predator that knew its prey could not escape. 11 hours she had been lying on this ridge, pressed so flat against the frozen rock that her body had become part of the mountain itself. The Hindu Kush stretched below her in shades of gray and white, a landscape so barren it seemed to belong to another world entirely. A world where warmth was only a distant memory and hope had frozen solid long before the first snows fell. Sarah did not move. Her breathing came in shallow pulls, each exhale measured to prevent the telltale mist that would betray her position to anyone watching the ridgeline with careful eyes. Her trigger finger had gone numb 3 hours ago, but she kept it resting against the guard of her M40A6, ready to slide into position at a moment's notice. The scope before her right eye showed the valley below in perfect clarity. Every shadow mapped, every rock formation cataloged in the quiet corners of her mind, where instinct lived alongside training and neither ever truly slept. The frost had worked its way through her gloves, turning her knuckles white and stiff. The ache in her spine had become a constant companion, radiating outward with each micro-adjustment she made to maintain her sight picture. Her lips were cracked from the dry mountain air, and the skin around her eyes felt raw from hours of unblinking vigilance. None of it mattered. Pain was just another form of information, and Sarah had learned long ago to process information without letting it distract her from what needed to be done. She was 33 years old. She had spent more years fighting the elements than most of the men on the radio had spent fighting anything at all. She had lain in mud so thick it seemed determined to swallow her whole. She had waded through sandstorms that turned the air into a wall of grinding particles. She had watched sunrises from positions she could not leave and sunsets she could not afford to admire. This mountain, for all its hostility, was just another place to work. And right now, the men she was supposed to be protecting were laughing at her. The earpiece crackled with their voices, carried across the mountain by encrypted frequencies that felt anything but secure. 12 Navy SEALs were advancing toward the insertion point below, their footsteps careful but their tongues careless, filling the silence with the kind of banter that came from men who believed they were untouchable. They moved in tactical formation, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the terrain with professional attention. But their mouths told a different story. "You think the contractor is still awake up there?" The voice belonged to someone young. Sarah could hear it in the cadence, the way he stretched his words like rubber bands, confident they would never snap back to hit him. There was laughter in that voice, the kind of easy mockery that came from someone who had never learned the cost of underestimating others. "Probably painting her nails," another voice answered, "or writing in her diary about how mean we are." Laughter rippled through the channel, sharp and dismissive. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she did not respond. She had learned that lesson long ago, back when she still believed that proving herself would silence the doubters. It never did. The doubters simply found new things to doubt. What was her call sign again? Coldsteel? A snort of derision cut through the static. More like cold feet. Bet she's never fired that rifle at anything that could shoot back. Probably got that call sign because she's about as warm as a freezer. More laughter. You see the look on her face at the briefing? Like she was smelling something bad the whole time. That's just how contractors look. They're all bitter about washing out of the real military. Sarah let the words wash over her like water off stone. She had heard variations of this conversation more times than she could count. Every new mission, every new team, every new group of young warriors who saw her contractor, patch, and her gender, and made their assumptions. She had stopped trying to correct those assumptions years ago. All that mattered was the work. "Hey, contractor." This voice was different, sharper. The voice of someone who wanted to make sure she heard every word, who wanted to see if he could provoke a reaction. "If you're even alive up there, do us a favor and stay out of the way. The grown-ups have work to do." Sarah's finger traced the edge of her rifle stock. The leather was cracked from years of use, worn smooth in places where her hands had gripped it through sandstorms and snowstorms, and the quiet desperation of missions that never made the news. She had carried this weapon through 3 continents. She had taught dozens of young rangers how to read wind with their skin instead of their instruments. She had watched partners die and buried friends whose names would never appear on any memorial. And now she was a contractor, A hired gun paid a fraction of what she was worth, assigned to provide overwatch for people who believed she was beneath them. The irony was not lost on her. The tragedy of it had stopped hurting a long time ago. She pressed the transmit button. Her voice came out flat, professional, stripped of any emotion that might give them satisfaction. Patterns off. Recommend delay insertion. A pause filled the channel, heavy with surprise that she had spoken at all. Then the laughter returned, louder this time, more pointed. Did she just say patterns off? The young voice again, dripping with amusement. What patterns? The pattern of her paranoia? Maybe she sees shapes in the clouds too. That one looks like a bunny. That one looks like certain death. Command, this is Overwatch. Sarah ignored them, speaking directly to the operations center miles away in a fortified building where officers watched satellite feeds and drank coffee and made decisions that determined who lived and who died. I'm seeing coordinated movement on the northern ridge. Shadow displacement inconsistent with wildlife. Advise immediate hold. The response came after a long moment, delivered in the detached tone of someone reading from a script. Someone who had never laid in the cold for 11 hours waiting for something to go wrong. Negative Overwatch. Continue observation. Ground team proceed as planned. Copy that, command. One of the SEALs, his voice rich with mock formality. We'll be sure to watch out for scary shadows. More laughter. Sarah released the transmit button and let the silence settle around her like a shroud. The wind picked up, howling across the ridge in a way that made the rocks sing with a low, mournful note. She had heard that sound before. In the Korangal Valley, 3 years ago, the night everything changed. The memory tried to surface, pushing up from the depths where she kept it buried. She could feel it stirring, heavy with blood and regret, and the weight of promises she was still trying to keep. Not now, she told herself. Not here. But the past did not care about her preferences. It never had. It was a patient hunter waiting for moments of stillness to strike. She closed her eyes for just a moment, and the memories came flooding back. 1 month earlier, Montana. The farmhouse sat at the end of a dirt road that seemed to stretch forever, cutting through fields of winter wheat that swayed in the wind like waves on a golden ocean. Sarah's rental car had kicked up dust for the last 3 miles, leaving a trail that hung in the still afternoon air, like a marker pointing directly to her location. Now she sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, staring at the front porch where an American flag hung limp against its pole, faded from years of sun and rain and the quiet passage of seasons. She had been sitting there for 15 minutes. She could not bring herself to open the door. The house belonged to Margaret Cross, 71 years old, widow of a Korean War veteran who had carried shrapnel in his leg for decades without complaint, mother of a son who had served his country with distinction until the day he stopped serving anything at all. Sarah had been to this house exactly 4 times in the past 3 years. Each visit felt like pressing her hand against an open wound, like picking at a scab that would never fully heal. But Margaret's letters kept coming, one every month, written in careful cursive on stationery that smelled faintly of lavender and hope. The letters always asked the same question, phrased in different ways but carrying the same desperate need for answers that no one seemed willing to provide. Have you found anything new? Does anyone know what really happened to my Nathan? Sarah had never been able to give her the answer she deserved. She had never been able to tell her the truth because the truth was still buried under layers of classified documents in official reports, and the institutional refusal to acknowledge mistakes that might make powerful people look bad. The front door opened, and Margaret Cross stepped onto the porch. She was a small woman barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a bun that had been her signature style for 50 years. Her eyes had seen too much grief to ever fully recover. They carried the permanent shadow of loss, the kind that settles into the soul and never quite leaves. She wore a simple blue dress and an apron dusted with flour, the uniform of a woman who had spent her life caring for others even when there was no one left to care for. When she saw Sarah's car, her face transformed with a mixture of joy and pain that made Sarah's chest ache with guilt and sorrow, and the desperate wish that she had something more to offer than empty hands. Sarah finally opened the door. The walk to the porch felt like crossing a battlefield. Each step brought her closer to the woman who had trusted her with the most important question of her life, and each step reminded Sarah that she had failed to answer it. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, impossibly loud in the afternoon stillness. A bird sang somewhere in the wheat fields, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Sarah. Margaret's voice cracked on the name. "Oh, sweet girl, come here." They embraced on the porch, two women bound together by the ghost of a man who had meant everything to both of them. Sarah could feel Margaret's thin shoulders shaking beneath her hands, could smell the lavender perfume and fresh flower, and the faint mustiness of a house where time had stopped mattering the day they lowered Nathan's coffin into the ground. "I made pie," Margaret said, when they finally pulled apart, wiping at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "Apple, Nathan's favorite. I remember how he used to sneak pieces before dinner when he was little. His father would scold him, but he always had that smile, no, that smile that could get him out of any trouble." Sarah swallowed hard around the lump in her throat. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." Margaret took her hand and led her inside, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small and aged. "It's been so long since I had anyone to cook for. The house gets so quiet sometimes. I catch myself setting two places at the table, and then I remember." The house was exactly as Sarah remembered it. Photographs covered every surface, chronicling Nathan's life from a gap-toothed toddler sitting on his father's shoulders to a grinning teenager in a football uniform, to a young man standing proud at his Army graduation, and finally to a photograph Sarah knew by heart, the one showing Nathan with his arm around her shoulders at their graduation from the sniper course. They were both smiling in that picture, squinting against the Georgia sun, unaware of how little time they had left together. That photograph had been taken 5 years ago, back when the world still made sense, back when Sarah still believed that skill and dedication could protect the people she loved. She had been wrong about so many things. They sat at the kitchen table, its surface worn smooth by decades of family meals and homework sessions and quiet conversations over morning coffee. Margaret poured from a pot that had been waiting since morning, the coffee strong and dark and slightly bitter from sitting too long. The pie sat between them, untouched, a gesture of normalcy in a conversation that could never be normal. "I got another letter back," Margaret said quietly. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out an envelope. Already opened, the paper inside worn soft from repeated reading. "From the Department of Defense, same as the others." Sarah took the letter and scanned its contents, though she already knew what it would say. The words were different each time, but the meaning never changed. Official language, bureaucratic sympathy, carefully constructed phrases designed to say nothing while appearing to say everything. "We have reviewed your inquiry regarding Sergeant First Class Nathan Cross. After thorough examination of all available evidence, we have found no new information that would warrant reopening the investigation into the circumstances of his death. The findings of the original report remain unchanged. SFC Cross died as a result of tactical miscalculation during a classified operation in a hostile theater. His service to this nation is deeply appreciated, and we extend our continued condolences to his family during this difficult time." "Tactical miscalculation," Margaret repeated, her voice hollow with the weariness of someone who had heard the same lie too many times. "That's what they call it. Like he made a mistake. Like my Nathan, who could read a battlefield better than anyone I ever knew, who used to call me every Sunday no matter where in the world he was stationed, who never once failed at anything he put his mind to, just forgot how to do his job." Sarah set the letter down on the table. Her hands were trembling, though she tried to hide it. "Margaret, You don't have to say anything, dear." Margaret reached across the table and covered Sarah's hands with her own. Her skin was paper thin, marked with age spots and the small scars of a lifetime spent working, but her touch was warm and steady. "I know you've been trying. I know you haven't given up on finding the truth. That's more than anyone else has done. The Army won't talk to me. His old unit acts like they never knew him. Even his friends, the ones who served with him, they won't return my calls anymore. You're the only one who still remembers." But Sarah had not found answers. 3 years of quiet investigation, of requesting documents that were always denied, of reaching out to former colleagues who suddenly became unavailable, of following leads that turned into dead ends. And she was no closer to the truth than she had been standing over Nathan's grave at Arlington, while a bugler played taps and a rifle squad fired their salute into the gray November sky. "There's something I never told you," Sarah said slowly, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. "Something I found in Nathan's belongings after. Something I've been carrying with me ever since, trying to understand what it means." Margaret's eyes sharpened with sudden intensity. "What is it?" Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. yellow with age, the creases soft from countless readings. It was covered in Nathan's familiar handwriting, the same neat print she had seen on countless range cards, in mission logs, in the occasional letter he would leave on her desk when words spoken out loud felt too difficult. "This is a draft," Sarah explained, "a report Nathan was writing 3 days before the mission. He never finished it. He never sent it through official channels. But I found it tucked inside his kit bag when they shipped his belongings home. I don't think anyone else ever saw it." Margaret took the paper with hands that shook worse than Sarah's. She read it slowly, her lips moving silently, her eyes growing wider with each line. When she looked up, her face had gone pale and her eyes were wet with tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ordinary grief. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew someone was. He suspected there was a leak in the unit." Sarah's voice hardened with the anger she usually kept buried. "Someone feeding information to the enemy. Someone who knew their routes, their timing, their communication frequencies. He was gathering evidence. He was building a case. He was going to report it to someone he trusted, someone outside the normal chain of command. But he never got the chance." "No." Sarah took the paper back, folding it with the careful reverence of someone handling a sacred text. And the official report, the one that blamed Nathan for tactical miscalculation, was signed by Major Victor Reese, the same officer who was Nathan's direct superior, the same officer who would have been the first to receive Nathan's complaint if he had lived long enough to file it. Margaret stared at her across the table, the untouched pie sitting between them like an offering to ghosts who could not taste it. "You think this Reese person?" "I think Nathan was getting too close to something dangerous, and someone made sure he would never get closer." Sarah tucked the paper back into her jacket, feeling its weight against her heart like a promise she was still learning how to keep. "I can't prove it. Not yet. But I'm not going to stop looking. Not ever." The afternoon light had shifted while they talked, painting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Margaret sat quietly for a long moment, her coffee growing cold in its cup, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. "Sarah." Her voice was different now, carrying an intensity that belied her frail frame and silver hair. "My son loved you. You know that, don't you? He told me before that last mission. He called me on a Sunday, same as always, but he talked longer than usual. He said you were the finest soldier he'd ever known, and the finest person. He said if anything ever happened to him, he knew you would keep fighting for the truth even when everyone else gave up." Sarah could not speak. The words stuck in her throat like broken glass, cutting with every breath. "He said you were stubborn," Margaret continued, a sad smile crossing her weathered face. "He said once you set your mind to something, nothing in the world could make you quit. He was proud of that. He said it was what made you such a good team." Sarah remembered those conversations. Late nights in forward operating bases when the mission was done and the adrenaline had faded and there was nothing left to do but wait for the next assignment. Nathan would talk about his mother, about the farm in Montana, about the life he wanted to build when his service was over. He had plans, dreams, a future that someone had stolen with bullets and lies. "Promise me," Margaret said, leaning forward with her hands still covering Sarah's. "Promise me you won't let them bury the truth along with my boy. Promise me that someday I'll know what really happened to my Nathan." Sarah met her eyes. "I promise." It was the same promise she had made to Nathan as he lay dying in her arms, his blood soaking into the desert sand, his voice fading to a whisper that she would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. "Don't stay silent," he had said. "Don't let them win. Promise me, Sarah. Promise me you'll find out who did this." She had kept that promise through 3 years of dead ends and official denials. She would keep it until her last breath. Now on the mountain, Sarah opened her eyes and pushed the memory away with the practiced discipline of someone who had learned to compartmentalize pain. The present demanded her attention. The present always did. Below her, the SEAL team had reached the halfway point of their approach. 12 figures moving in tactical formation, their outlines barely visible against the gray and white landscape of the Hindu Kush. From this distance, they looked like toys, fragile things that could be broken by the slightest pressure, by a single miscalculation, by enemies they did not know were watching. Sarah scanned the ridge lines again, searching for the anomalies that had triggered her warning. There, a shadow that had shifted in a way shadows should not shift when no clouds moved overhead. And there, a glint of metal where no metal should be, brief and quickly hidden but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. And there, a disturbance in the snow that spoke of recent movement, of boots pressing into powder, of bodies settling into firing positions. Three positions, three angles of fire, a killing box waiting to be sprung. She had seen this pattern before. She had lived through it once and carried the scars ever since. Her fingers tightened on the rifle stock as her mind raced through the calculations. If she was right, if this was what she thought it was, then those 12 men had maybe 15 minutes before they walked into a slaughter. If she was wrong, she was about to destroy whatever was left of her professional reputation. But she was not wrong. She knew it in her bones, in the part of her that had been forged by years of combat and loss and the bitter education of watching good people die because someone ignored the warning signs. She pressed the transmit button. Command, this is Overwatch. Final warning. I am observing coordinated staging on northern, western, and elevated positions. Pattern matches documented ambush formations used by hostile forces in this region. Strongly advise immediate hold and reassessment of the tactical situation. The silence that followed felt like the space between heartbeats, heavy with possibility and dread. Then the young voice came back, dripping with condescension. Jesus Christ, she really won't let it go. Hey, contractor, maybe stick to what you're good at, which is apparently being scared of rocks and shadows. Another voice cut in, deeper, older. Master Chief Derek Sullivan, the senior enlisted man in the unit. Sarah had read his file before the mission. 20 years of service. Deployments to every hot zone the nation had opened in that time. A Silver Star from Fallujah and a brother buried at Arlington. He was the kind of man who had seen enough to know that experience came in many forms. Overwatch, this is ground actual. What exactly are you seeing? Sarah felt a flicker of hope, small but persistent. Someone was finally listening. Ground actual, I have visual on coordinated movement across three positions. Shadow displacement on the northern ridge suggests at least 4 personnel moving into overlapping fields of fire. Western position showing intermittent reflections consistent with optical equipment, likely scopes or binoculars. Elevated position at our 2 o'clock has disturbed snow patterns indicating recent occupation and deliberate concealment. This matches the triangulated ambush formation documented in after-action reports from the Korengal Valley in 2022. It is a killing box, Master Chief. They are waiting for you to walk into it. She did not mention that she had been present for that ambush in the Korengal. She did not mention that she had watched her partner die in almost exactly this configuration, that she still heard his voice in her dreams, that she carried his unfinished report next to her heart like a talisman against despair. Some things were not meant for radio channels. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect, or at least the beginning of doubt about the assumptions his team had made. Command, ground actual, requesting permission to hold position pending further reconnaissance of the areas identified by Overwatch. Negative ground actual. The operations center responded without hesitation, the voice flat and certain and utterly disconnected from the reality on the ground. Intel assessment shows minimal hostile presence in target area. All satellite coverage indicates clear approach vectors. Continue mission as planned. Overwatch is to maintain observation only. Copy that. Sullivan's voice had flattened, returning to the professional neutrality of a man following orders he did not necessarily agree with. Ground team proceeding. The laughter returned to the channel, softer now, but still present, still mocking. Guess the contractor got told. Someone should get her some hot cocoa, maybe a blanket and a teddy bear. I heard she used to be somebody, back in the day, some kind of instructor or something. Hard to believe looking at how she acts now. Sarah switched off her transmit capability and let their voices wash over her like static. They did not know her. They did not know what she had done, what she had lost, what she carried with her every moment of every day. They saw a contractor's patch and a woman's name on a roster and made their assumptions, the same assumptions that had been made about her 1,000 times before. She had stopped trying to change people's minds a long time ago. All she could do was her job. Through her scope, she tracked the movement of the team, noting their spacing, their sight lines, their vulnerability. Her attention kept returning to one figure in particular, the youngest member of the unit, identifiable by his slightly smaller frame and the way he moved with the aggressive energy of someone who had not yet learned that caution was not the same as cowardice. Petty Officer Second Class Kyle Dawson, 24 years old, fresh from advanced training with marks that suggested genuine talent. The report said he was gifted, one of the best marksmen to come through the program in years, a natural shooter with instincts that could not be taught. Sarah watched him joke with the man beside him, his body language loose and confident, utterly unaware of the danger that might be waiting in the rocks above. He reminded her of someone, the way he held his weapon, the tilt of his head when he assessed terrain, the easy arrogance of youth and skill combined, the belief that talent was armor against the randomness of combat. He reminded her of Nathan, not the Nathan who had died in her arms, broken and bleeding and fighting for every breath, but the Nathan she had met 5 years ago at Fort Benning when he had been nothing but potential wrapped in ego. The memory surfaced without permission, playing behind her eyes like film footage she could not turn off. Fort Benning, 5 years ago. The sun had been merciless that Georgia summer, turning the rifle range into a furnace that tested the will of every candidate. Heat shimmered off the concrete in visible waves, distorting the air, making the distant targets dance and waver like mirages. Sarah had been an instructor then, one of the few women to ever hold the position in the Army's sniper school. She had earned the role through years of exceptional performance, through shots that other soldiers whispered about in barracks across 3 continents, through a quiet competence that even the most skeptical superiors could not deny. But respect came hard in a world that measured worth by certain criteria that had nothing to do with skill. Every new class brought fresh doubters, fresh challengers, fresh young men who believed they already knew everything worth knowing and saw a female instructor as an obstacle rather than a resource. Nathan Cross had been the worst of them. He had swagger from the moment he stepped onto the range, his file thick with commendations from Ranger School, his confidence radiating like heat from the sun-baked concrete. He was 27 years old, already marked for great things by commanders who saw his potential, already convinced that the sniper course was merely a formality he needed to complete before moving on to the real work of his military career. Sarah had watched him for 3 days, observing without comment as he hit target after target with mechanical precision. He was good, better than good. His fundamentals were textbook perfect, his breathing controlled, his trigger discipline exemplary. Other instructors praised him openly, predicting he would graduate at the top of his class. But he had a flaw, a fatal one for a sniper. He believed his skill made him infallible. On the 4th day, she called him to the 1,000-yard line. Sergeant Cross, her voice carried across the range with the authority of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. Set up on the target. Nathan had complied with barely concealed impatience, settling into his position with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The target sat small and still in the distance, a challenge that most candidates would approach with humility and careful preparation. Nathan approached it with contempt. "Wind call?" Sarah asked. 3 minutes right. He answered without hesitation, already adjusting his scope. "Steady from the east, maybe 8 miles per hour. Standard compensation." "You're sure?" "Ma'am, I've been making wind calls since I was 12 years old. My father taught me to shoot before I learned to ride a bicycle." "I'm sure." Sarah said nothing. She simply stood behind him, arms crossed, face impassive, as he took his shot. The round went wide. Not by much, but enough. The impact kicked up dust 2 feet to the left of center mass. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Gust threw me off at the last second. Take another." He did. The same result. And another. And another. For the next hour, Sarah had him fire shot after shot, and not a single one found its mark. Round after round, misses after miss, the target standing untouched while the best shooter in the class failed to hit it. By the end, Nathan was trembling with frustration, his confidence shattered, his ego crushed beneath the weight of repeated failure. The other candidates watched from a distance, silent and fascinated, as the class's golden boy was methodically dismantled by the quiet female instructor they had all underestimated. Finally, Sarah stepped forward. "You know what your problem is, Sergeant Cross?" Nathan did not answer. He could barely meet her eyes. "You're reading the wind wrong." She crouched beside him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Not at the muzzle, you've got that perfect. Your local assessment is textbook accurate, but you're missing what happens at 700 yards, where the valley funnels the airflow through that gap in the hills. You're so focused on what's in front of you that you can't see what's waiting ahead." She pointed to a clump of grass far downrange, barely visible to the naked eye. Watch that grass. Don't look at your instruments. Don't trust your calculations. Feel it. The wind tells you everything you need to know, if you're humble enough to listen. Nathan watched the grass. For a long moment, nothing changed. His body remained tense, his pride still stinging from an hour of public failure. Then slowly, something shifted in his expression. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing deepened. He made an adjustment to his scope that went against everything his training had taught him. An adjustment based not on numbers, but on instinct. He fired. The round found its mark with a clean, precise impact that echoed across the range. Nathan stared through his scope at the target, disbelief written across his features. When he turned to look at Sarah, something had changed in his eyes. The arrogance was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Something that looked almost like respect. "How did you know?" he asked. "Because I made the same mistake once." Sarah straightened up, her face still impassive. "Skill doesn't mean wisdom, Sergeant. Wisdom is knowing how much you still have to learn." From that day forward, Nathan had been different. Still confident, still ambitious, but tempered by an awareness that had been missing before. He sought Sarah out for extra instruction, stayed late on the range to practice the techniques she taught him, asked questions that showed he was actually listening to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to speak. By the end of the course, he was the top graduate. By the end of the next year, he was her partner, her spotter, her friend, the one person in the world she trusted without reservation. And then he was gone. On the mountain, Sarah blinked away the memory and forced herself to focus on the present. The SEAL team had covered another 100 meters while she was lost in the past. Kyle Dawson was still joking with his teammates, still oblivious, still carrying himself with the same dangerous confidence that Nathan had once worn like armor, before he learned that armor could be penetrated. She wondered if anyone would ever teach Dawson the way she had taught Nathan. She wondered if he would survive long enough to learn that skill without wisdom was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The wind shifted suddenly, sweeping hard across the slope and carrying with it something that made Sarah's blood run cold. A sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable to someone who had learned to hear death before it arrived. Metal clicking against metal, the sound of weapons being readied, the sound of an ambush preparing to spring. Sarah pressed her eye harder against the scope, scanning the northern ridge with desperate intensity. There, a flash of movement, a shadow separating from the rocks, and another, and another. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Command, this is Overwatch." Her voice came out steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I have visual confirmation of hostile forces staging on Northern Ridge. Multiple personnel armed and in firing positions. Request immediate extraction of ground team." Static filled her ear. Then the voice of the operations officer, unchanged, unmoved. "Overwatch, we are not seeing any hostile indicators on satellite coverage. Maintain observation." "Command, I am looking at them right now. They are setting up a kill zone. If ground team continues on current heading, they will be walking into a massacre." "Negative, Overwatch. Your assessment does not match current intel. Ground team is to proceed as planned." Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the radio from her ear and throw it down the mountain and watch it shatter on the rocks below. She wanted to transport herself back in time to the moment when she had agreed to take this contract. Back to a world where she still had the authority to make decisions that mattered, where her voice carried weight, where her warnings would be heeded. But she was a contractor now, a hired gun, a woman whose warnings meant nothing to the men who held the power to save lives or throw them away. She watched through her scope as the SEAL team continued forward, 12 men walking toward their deaths with jokes on their lips and laughter in their throats. Kyle Dawson was at the rear of the formation now, his young face visible for just a moment as he turned to say something to the man beside him. He was smiling. Sarah thought of Nathan. She thought of Margaret Cross, sitting alone in her farmhouse in Montana, waiting for answers that never came. She thought of the promise she had made, the promise to never stay silent, to never let them win, to never again watch good people die because someone refused to listen. She thought of the folded paper in her pocket, yellow with age, carrying the last words Nathan ever wrote before someone made sure he would never write again. And she made a decision. If the system would not protect these men, she would, even if it cost her everything, even if they never knew who had saved them, even if she died on this mountain with nothing but the wind to remember her name. She would not watch another team die. Not again. Never again. Sarah settled deeper into her position, her rifle steady despite the cold that had seeped into every fiber of her being. The enemy was staging. The clock was ticking. And somewhere below, 12 men who had laughed at her warnings were running out of time. She began to calculate distances, angles, wind speeds. She mapped escape routes in her mind, identified positions of cover, assessed which targets would need to be eliminated first to create a survivable corridor. Her training took over, the product of years of preparation for moments exactly like this one. She was not supposed to engage. Her orders were clear, observation only. But Sarah Morgan had spent her entire life following orders, and it had cost her the person she loved most in the world. She had watched Nathan die because someone in the chain of command had decided that the truth was less important than the mission, that convenient lies were preferable to inconvenient facts. She would not make that mistake again. Through her scope, she watched the shadows on the northern ridge grow more defined, resolving into shapes that were unmistakably human. 4, 5, 6 figures, more on the western position, more still on the elevated ground to the east. This was not a chance encounter. This was not bad luck or poor timing. This was a planned operation coordinated across multiple positions, designed to annihilate the SEAL team in a single devastating crossfire. And someone had known they were coming. Sarah's finger moved to the trigger. She thought of Margaret's letters, written in careful cursive, asking questions that deserved answers. She thought of Nathan's draft report, warning of a traitor within their ranks, buried and forgotten by those who should have listened. She thought of the young SEAL below, Kyle Dawson, so full of life and arrogance and potential, so unaware of the hammer about to fall. The wind howled across the mountain like a warning from ghosts long dead. Sarah Morgan, the woman they called Coldsteel, waited for the moment that would change everything. It came faster than she expected. A flash of light on the northern ridge, the distinctive crack of automatic weapons. The sky itself seemed to split apart as tracer fire arced down toward the valley, painting bright lines of death across the gray Afghan morning. The screaming began immediately. Sarah watched the SEAL team scatter, diving for cover that was already compromised, returning fire at targets they could barely see. Kyle Dawson went down first, hit in the leg, his face contorted with shock and pain as he crawled toward a boulder that would not save him from the angles of fire converging on his position. The radio exploded with panicked voices. Contact north! Contact north! We're pinned! Dawson's hit! We need a medic! Where are they? Where the hell are they? And then, cutting through the chaos like a knife through flesh, a voice she would never forget. A voice filled with terror and desperation, and the sudden understanding that death was very close. Save us! Someone save us! Please! Sarah Morgan did not hesitate. She took her first shot. The first round left Sarah Morgan's rifle with a crack that split the mountain air like thunder from a clear sky. The recoil pressed against her shoulder with familiar weight, and before the sound had finished echoing across the valley, she was already cycling the bolt, already acquiring her second target, already breathing out the tension that came with taking a life she had no choice but to take. The machine gunner on the northern ridge dropped without a sound. One moment he was pouring fire down into the valley where 12 SEALs scrambled for cover, his weapons spitting death in controlled bursts that tore apart the rocks and snow. The next moment he was falling backward, his grip on the gun going slack, his body tumbling down the rocky slope like a puppet whose strings had been cut by an invisible hand. Sarah did not watch him fall. She had already moved on. Her second shot followed 2 heartbeats after the first, finding the spotter who had been feeding coordinates to the fallen gunner. He had turned at the sound of his partner's death, confusion written across his face in the split second before the bullet found him. His binoculars spun away into the snow as he collapsed, catching the gray morning light in a final flash before disappearing into a drift. 3, 4, 5. Sarah worked with the cold efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this. Each shot was a calculation made flesh, a solution to an equation written in angles and wind speed and the desperate mathematics of survival. The enemy had not expected fire from her position. They had planned their ambush around the SEALs in the valley, not the lone contractor on the ridge they had dismissed as worthless. That dismissal was costing them dearly now. Through her scope, she could see the confusion spreading through the enemy positions like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Men who had been confident moments ago were now scrambling, trying to locate the source of the fire that was dismantling their carefully planned ambush, one body at a time. Some turned their weapons toward the ridge where she lay, spraying bullets in her general direction with more desperation than accuracy. Others abandoned their positions entirely, retreating into the rocks with the panicked movements of prey that had suddenly discovered it was being hunted by something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. But there were too many of them. For every gunner she dropped, two more seemed to take his place. The fire pouring down into the valley barely slowed, the SEALs still pinned behind inadequate cover, still screaming into their radios for support that was not coming fast enough. She could hear their voices through her earpiece, fragmented and frantic, the cool professionalism of their training giving way to the raw fear of men who knew they were dying. "Medic, we need a medic over here. I can't move. They've got the approach zeroed." "Where's that fire coming from? The ridge? Who's on the ridge?" Sarah's hands moved with mechanical precision as she reloaded, her fingers finding the familiar grooves of her rifle despite the numbness that had spread through them during the 11 hours she had spent frozen to the mountainside. The cold did not matter now. The exhaustion did not matter. All that mattered was the next shot, and the next after that, each one a small victory against the darkness closing in around the men below. She shifted her position slightly, acquiring a new angle on the western ridge where another machine gun nest had opened up. The gunner there was good, maintaining disciplined bursts that kept the SEALs pressed flat against the ground, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to his fire. She could see the tracers arcing down from his position, bright lines of death cutting through the gray morning air, like the fingers of some malevolent god reaching down to pluck souls from the earth. She took a breath, released half of it, felt her heartbeat slowed to the rhythm she had trained it to find in moments like this. Squeezed the trigger with a pressure as gentle and inevitable as the fall of night. The gunner jerked once and went still, slumping forward over his weapon. The tracers stopped. For a moment, a brief and precious moment, the valley went quiet. Then the radio in Sarah's ear exploded with voices. "Who the hell is shooting? Is that ours? Hostiles are going down, but I don't see any air support overhead. Where's it coming from? I can't get a fix on the angle. Whoever it is, they just saved our asses. Keep moving while we have the chance." Sarah recognized the last voice. Master Chief Derek Sullivan, his words clipped and professional, despite the chaos swirling around him like a storm. He was already adapting to the changed situation, already thinking about how to use the unexpected respite to get his men to safety. She had read his file before the mission, had seen the long list of deployments and commendations, and the quiet notation about a brother lost in Fallujah 10 years ago. That notation had stuck with her. It always did when she found it in the files of the men she was assigned to protect. The shared experience of loss created a connection, invisible and unspoken, that transcended rank and service branch, and all the petty hierarchies that usually divided people who wore different patches on their shoulders. Sullivan had lost a brother. Sarah had lost a partner. They were both members of a club that no one wanted to join. She wondered if he would understand when this was over. She wondered if he would see her differently than he had seen her before the shooting started. But that was a question for later. Right now, she had bought the team time with her shots, but she had also revealed herself. The enemy had stopped firing into the valley. Now they were scanning the ridges, searching for the sniper who had disrupted their ambush with such devastating precision. Sarah could see them moving through her scope, repositioning, bringing their weapons to bear on the slopes above. It would not take them long to narrow down her location. The mathematics of trajectory and bullet origin were not complicated for men who had set up this killing box with professional precision that spoke of training and experience in the cold patience of predators who had hunted human prey before. She needed to move. Sarah began her displacement with practiced economy of motion, sliding backward through the rocks without disturbing the snow that would betray her position to watching eyes. Her ghillie veil dragged across the frozen ground, the frost-covered fabric blending with the gray and white landscape until she was almost invisible even from a few feet away. She had learned this skill in places where discovery meant death, and she applied it now with the desperate focus of someone who knew the odds were turning against her with every passing second. Behind her, the hide she had occupied for 11 hours received a storm of gunfire. Bullets cracked against rock, sending chips of stone spinning through the air where her head had been moments before. The enemy had found her position. They had simply found it too late. She slid into her secondary hide, a narrow depression between two boulders that she had identified during her initial survey of the terrain. It offered a different angle on the valley, a different set of targets, and most importantly, it was not where they expected her to be. Through her scope, she assessed the changed battlefield. The SEALs had used the lull to advance toward a narrow ravine that cut through the eastern slope. She recognized the terrain from satellite imagery she had studied before the mission. The locals called it the Serpent's Cut, a winding passage through the mountains that offered defensible positions and limited angles of approach. If the team could reach it, they would have a chance. But between them and safety lay 200 meters of open ground, and the enemy was recovering from their confusion. Sarah watched a group of fighters emerge from the rocks on the northern ridge, moving with coordinated purpose toward positions that would cut off the SEALs' escape route. They were not panicked militia or untrained insurgents. They moved like soldiers, like men who had done this before, who had rehearsed these movements until they became instinct. This was not a random ambush. This was a professional operation. The realization settled into Sarah's chest like ice water filling a cavity she had not known existed. Someone had planned this with military precision. Someone had known exactly when and where the SEAL team would be advancing. Someone had positioned forces to create overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions and secondary assault elements that could adapt to changing circumstances. Someone had betrayed them. She thought of Nathan's draft report, the one she carried next to her heart in the pocket of her tactical vest. Someone feeding information to the enemy. Someone who knew their routes, their timing, their communication frequencies. He had seen it 3 years ago, and it had cost him his life. Now she was seeing it again, and 12 more men were at risk because the same pattern was repeating itself with terrible, inevitable precision. Sarah pushed the thought aside and focused on what she could control. The fighters moving toward the escape route. The angle of fire required to stop them. The wind speed and direction, and the thousand small factors that determined whether a bullet found its mark or sailed harmlessly past. She took the shot. The lead fighter dropped, and for a moment the others froze, uncertain where the fire had come from. Sarah used that moment to acquire her second target, then her third. By the time the survivors realized they were being picked off from a new position, 3 more of their number lay motionless on the rocks. The rest scattered into cover, their advance halted. In the valley below, Sullivan was pushing his team forward, using every scrap of concealment the terrain offered. Sarah could see him directing his men with hand signals, his body language radiating the calm authority of someone who had led men through hell before and knew the way out. But one of his men was not moving. Kyle Dawson lay behind a boulder at the rear of the formation, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood staining the snow around him in an expanding pool of crimson that grew larger with each heartbeat. He was conscious, his face pale with shock and pain, his hands pressed against the wound in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding that was slowly draining his life onto the frozen ground. He had been hit in those first moments of the ambush, and he was not going to make it to the Serpent's Cut without help. Sarah watched one of the other SEALs break from the formation and run back toward Dawson. The man moved with the desperate speed of someone who knew every second counted. His body low to the ground, his weapon forgotten in his hand as he focused solely on reaching his fallen teammate. He made it halfway before a burst of fire from the western ridge cut him down. The SEAL tumbled forward, rolled twice, and lay still. His body came to rest just 10 feet from Dawson, close enough that the wounded man could see his face, could see the vacant eyes staring at nothing, could see the blood spreading from wounds that had killed him before he hit the ground. Sarah heard the scream through her earpiece, raw, primal, the sound of a young man watching a friend die in front of him. She swept her scope toward the western ridge, searching for the gunner who had fired. There, a figure prone behind a low wall of stacked stones, his weapon trained on the open ground between Dawson and the rest of the team. He was waiting for another rescue attempt, waiting for another target to present itself, patient as a spider in its web. Sarah took a breath. The wind gusted hard from the north, carrying snow crystals that stung her exposed cheek like tiny needles of ice. She made the adjustment without conscious thought, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 practice shots. She fired. The gunner's weapon jerked upward as the bullet found him, then fell silent as his body slumped over the stones. But even as he died, another fighter was moving to take his place, and another behind him, and the mathematics of the situation became terrifyingly clear. There were too many of them. She could not protect everyone. She could not save them all. The old guilt stirred in her chest, rising from the depths where she tried to keep it buried. It was the same guilt that had haunted her since the Korengal Valley, since the night Nathan died in her arms. She had been unable to save him. She had watched the life fade from his eyes while calling for medevac that came too late, while applying pressure to wounds that were too severe, while promising him that everything would be all right even though they both knew it was a lie. She had failed him, and now on another mountain in another country, she was watching history repeat itself. No, the word formed in her mind with the force of a command, shoving back the doubt and the fear and the memories that threatened to paralyze her. No, not again, not this time. Sarah forced the guilt away and focused on the immediate problem. Dawson was trapped. The open ground between him and the team was a killing field. Anyone who tried to cross it would die, unless someone changed the equation. She needed to do something she had not done in 3 years. She needed to leave her position and enter the fight directly. The thought should have terrified her. A sniper's power came from distance, from anonymity, from the ability to strike without being struck. To abandon that advantage was to become just another target, another body in a firefight where numbers and positioning favored the enemy. But Sarah Morgan had stopped being afraid of death a long time ago. What she feared now was something far worse. She feared watching another young soldier die because she was not willing to take the risk. As she prepared to move, her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Not from the SEALs, not from command. Something else entirely, a burst of static followed by a voice that made her blood freeze in her veins. The voice was speaking in code, but not a code she did not recognize. It was NATO phonetic alphabet, the same system used by American military forces around the world. And the call sign that preceded the message was one that sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Reaper Actual, this is Overwatch 2. Package is still mobile. Request permission to engage. Reaper Actual. That was the call sign of her old unit, the unit she had served with before Nathan's death, the unit that Major Victor Reese had commanded before he was quietly transferred to a desk job somewhere far from the questions Sarah had been asking. Someone on the enemy side was using American military call signs. Someone was communicating in NATO standard code. Someone had access to frequencies and protocols that should have been secure. This was not just a betrayal, this was something far worse. Sarah's mind raced through the implications as she began her descent toward the valley floor. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to maintain overwatch, to fight the battle from safety. She ignored them all. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and she had been carrying this one for far too long. The descent was treacherous. Loose rocks shifted beneath her boots, threatening to send her tumbling down the mountainside in a fall that would break bones and expose her to enemy fire. Ice covered the steeper sections, forcing her to find handholds and cracks that bit into her frozen fingers with jagged teeth of stone. The ghillie veil caught on outcroppings, tearing in places, leaving pieces of herself scattered across the slope like breadcrumbs marking her path. Gunfire crackled around her as the enemy realized what she was doing. Bullets whined off rocks inches from her head, sending chips of stone into the air where her head had been moments before. One round tugged at her sleeve, close enough to tear fabric, not quite close enough to draw blood. Another struck the boulder she was using for cover, the impact vibrating through the stone like a bell being rung by an angry god. She did not stop. She could not stop. Somewhere below her, a young man was bleeding out, and the only chance he had was a woman the SEALs had dismissed as worthless. The irony was not lost on her. It simply did not matter. As she moved, her mind kept returning to the radio transmission she had intercepted. Reaper Actual. The call sign conjured memories she had tried to bury, memories of a time before everything fell apart. She remembered the day Nathan had first mentioned his suspicions about Reese. They had been sitting in a makeshift mess hall at a forward operating base, the kind of plywood and canvas structure that passed for civilization in places where civilization had long since fled. Nathan had been quiet that evening, picking at his food with the distracted air of someone working through a problem he could not quite solve. "Something's wrong," he had said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "The intel we're getting, it's too good. And the missions that go bad, they go bad in ways that don't make sense." Sarah had asked him what he meant, and he had told her about patterns he had noticed. Ambushes that seemed to know exactly where they would be. Enemy forces that appeared in positions that should have been secure. Communications that were intercepted despite using frequencies that were supposedly uncompromised. I think someone's feeding them information, Nathan had said. Someone inside the chain of command. Someone who knows things they shouldn't know. She had asked if he had told anyone else, and he had shaken his head. I need proof first. I need something concrete before I go making accusations that could destroy someone's career. Or my own. 3 days later, he was dead. Now, 3 years later, she was hearing his old unit's call sign coming from enemy radios. The proof he had been looking for was finally appearing, and it had arrived too late to save him. But maybe not too late to save the men in the valley below. Sarah reached the base of the slope and sprinted across the open ground, her rifle clutched to her chest, her body bent low to present a smaller target. The distance between her and Dawson seemed to stretch forever, each step an eternity of exposure and vulnerability. She could hear rounds snapping past her, could feel the displacement of air as bullets missed her by inches, could sense death reaching for her with fingers that just barely failed to find purchase. She did not slow down. When she reached Dawson, she dropped into a slide that brought her to a stop beside his boulder, her body scraping across the rocks and snow in a controlled crash that left her breathless but alive. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding against her ribs, her body screaming with the exertion of the descent and the sprint. But she was alive, and so was he. Dawson stared at her with eyes that could not quite process what they were seeing. His face was gray with blood loss, his lips moving without sound, his hands still pressed uselessly against the wound in his leg that was slowly killing him. You, he managed finally, his voice barely a whisper. The contractor. Sarah did not waste time on words. She pulled a tourniquet from her kit and went to work on his leg, her hands moving with the speed and precision of someone who had done this too many times before in too many places where good people died for bad reasons. The wound was bad, a through and through that had hit the femoral artery. He had minutes at most before he bled out. She cinched the tourniquet tight, ignoring his scream of pain, ignoring the gunfire that continued to crack overhead, ignoring everything except the task in front of her. The bleeding slowed. The tourniquet held. He would not die here. Not yet. Not if she had anything to say about it. Can you move? She asked. Dawson's jaw was clenched against the pain, but he managed a nod. I can try. Then try. We're getting you to your team. She pulled his arm over her shoulder and lifted, staggering under his weight. He was bigger than her, heavier, and the wound made it impossible for him to support himself properly. They lurched forward together, two figures stumbling across a battlefield that was trying very hard to kill them both. The open ground seemed even wider now than it had from above. Every step was a gamble, every second an invitation for a bullet to find them. Sarah kept them moving toward the rest of the team, toward Sullivan and the other SEALs who had taken cover near the entrance to the Serpent's Cut. As they moved, Sarah noticed something that made her tactical mind file away a piece of information for later examination. One of the SEALs, a man she recognized from the mission briefing as Petty Officer Marcus Webb, was not providing covering fire like the others. He was crouched behind a rock, his weapon pointed in the general direction of the enemy, but his attention was focused on something in his hand. A phone. He was looking at a phone in the middle of a firefight. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of operating in environments where trust was a luxury that could get you killed, immediately flagged the behavior as wrong. No one checked their phone during a combat engagement. No one. Unless they were communicating with someone who should not be receiving communications. She filed the observation away and kept moving. There would be time to deal with Webb later. Right now, survival was all that mattered. Halfway to the ravine, Dawson stumbled and nearly took them both down. Sarah caught him, braced herself against his weight, and forced them both upright through sheer will and the desperate strength that came from refusing to accept failure. Keep going, she said through gritted teeth. We're almost there. Why? His voice was barely a whisper, strained with pain and confusion. You don't even know us. We were horrible to you, called you names, said you were worthless. Why are you doing this? Sarah thought of Nathan. She thought of the promise she had made to him, to Margaret, to herself. She thought of all the people she had failed to save, and all the reasons why she could not fail again. She thought of the young man in her arms, so like Nathan had been at that age, so full of potential that might never be realized if she stopped moving now. I once knew someone like you, she said. Young, talented, full of swagger. He thought he knew everything, just like you do. But he learned, he grew. He became one of the finest soldiers I ever knew. She paused, adjusting her grip on Dawson's weight. He died because I couldn't save him, because I stayed silent when I should have spoken, because I followed orders when I should have trusted my instincts. They covered another 10 meters, bullets kicking up snow around them. I'm not going to make that mistake again. Not with you, not with anyone, because that's what he would have wanted. That's what I promised him I would do. Dawson did not respond, but she felt something change in the way he leaned against her. The dead weight of despair became something else, something that felt almost like trust. He was fighting now, helping as much as his wounded body would allow, pushing forward instead of simply being carried. They covered the last 50 meters in a blur of desperate motion. Sullivan appeared at her side, taking Dawson's weight, shouting orders to his men to provide covering fire. Hands reached out to pull them behind cover, to press fresh bandages against Dawson's wound, to create a barrier of bodies and weapons between them and the enemy. Sarah collapsed against a rock, her breathing ragged, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. She had made it. They had both made it. But the battle was not over. Sullivan knelt beside her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, and the grim determination of a man who had seen too many fights to be defeated by this one. His eyes were different now than they had been before the ambush. The dismissive skepticism was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. That was insane, he said. You could have stayed on the ridge. You could have kept shooting from a safe distance. No, Sarah replied, I couldn't. Sullivan studied her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Behind his eyes, she could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about her, discarding the assumptions he had made based on her contractor status and her gender, and all the other labels people use to avoid really seeing each other. My brother died in Fallujah, he said quietly. 10 years ago, IED on the main supply route. They told me he died instantly, but I never really believed that. I think they just say that to make it easier for the families. Sarah met his gaze. I lost my partner 3 years ago. Ambush in the Korangal Valley. He died in my arms. Took him 20 minutes. Sullivan nodded slowly, the nod of someone who understood a truth that could not be expressed in words. They were members of the same club now, bound by losses that would never fully heal. What's your name, he asked. Your real name, not the contractor bullshit they put on the roster. Sarah Morgan, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, retired. She paused. They used to call me Coldsteel. Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes. Recognition. I've heard that name. The sniper instructor at Benning, the one who could read wind like it was talking to her. That was me, a long time ago. Sullivan shook his head, a rueful smile crossing his weathered face. We've been taking orders from a legend and treating her like she was nothing. If we get out of this, I owe you a hell of an apology. If we get out of this, Sarah said, I'll hold you to that. Sullivan stood and turned back to the battle. We need to move. The contractor bought us time, but they're regrouping. Serpent's Cut is 200 meters east. We move fast, we move together, we don't leave anyone behind. His men responded with the focused efficiency of professionals adapting to changed circumstances. Some helped the wounded, including Dawson, who had been stabilized enough to hobble with support. Others took up positions to cover the retreat, their weapons trained on the ridges where the enemy continued to maneuver. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the protests of muscles that had been pushed far beyond their limits. She still had work to do. As the team began to move, she fell into position at the rear, her rifle ready, her eyes scanning the terrain for threats. The enemy had not given up. She could see them moving on the ridges, repositioning for another assault. They had lost their initial advantage, but they still had numbers, and they were not going to let the SEALs escape without a fight. She dropped 2 more fighters as they tried to flank the retreating team, the shots echoing across the valley like punctuation marks in a sentence written in violence. Each trigger pull was another calculation, another adjustment, another small victory in a battle that was far from won. Her attention kept returning to Webb, who was moving with the rest of the team, but whose behavior continued to strike her as wrong. He was too calm, too controlled, too focused on something other than the immediate danger. Once, when he thought no one was watching, she saw him glance at his phone again, his thumb moving across the screen in a gesture that looked like typing. She did not say anything. Not yet. Accusations without proof would only create chaos, and chaos was the last thing they needed right now. But she filed the observation away, adding it to the growing list of evidence that pointed toward a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. There was a traitor among them. The entrance to the Serpent's Cut loomed ahead, a narrow gap in the rock face that promised shelter and defensible positions. Sullivan's team was almost there, almost safe, almost home. And then her radio crackled with a voice that stopped her cold. It was not one of the SEALs. It was not command. It was something else entirely. A transmission on a frequency that should have been encrypted, should have been secure, should have been impossible for anyone outside the American military to access. Coldsteel. The word hung in the air like a curse. Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. I know you can hear me, Sarah Morgan. I know you're down there, playing hero again, trying to save people who don't deserve to be saved. The voice was male, calm, American, and it was using her call sign, the one that appeared nowhere in her contractor file, the one that only people from her past would know. You always were stubborn. Nathan used to say it was your best quality. He was wrong, of course. It's actually your worst. It makes you predictable. Sarah's finger tightened on her rifle, but there was nothing to shoot at. The voice was coming through her earpiece, disembodied, impossible to trace. You want to know something funny? I didn't expect you to be here. When I planned this operation, you weren't part of the equation, just a random contractor assigned to overwatch duty. But then I saw your name on the roster, and I realized this was fate, the universe giving me a chance to finish what I started 3 years ago. 3 years ago, the Korengal Valley, Nathan. Who are you? Sarah's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible even to herself. Oh, you know who I am. You just don't want to admit it. You've been looking for me for 3 years, Sarah, digging through files, asking questions, making yourself a nuisance to people who would rather forget that night ever happened. A pause heavy with satisfaction. I have to say, you've been more persistent than I expected. Most people would have given up by now, but not you, not Sarah Morgan, not Coldsteel. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities, through the names and faces of everyone who could have known about that night. Who could have accessed the frequencies? Who could have organized an ambush with this level of precision? And then she knew. Reese. Laughter came through the earpiece, cold and amused. Very good. Major Victor Reese at your service, although I suppose the rank doesn't mean much anymore, does it? Not after what happened. Not after Nathan decided to be a hero and file that report. The world seemed to narrow around Sarah, compressing until there was nothing but the voice in her ear and the rage building in her chest like a fire that had been waiting years for fuel. Victor Reese, the man who had signed the report blaming Nathan for his own death. The man who had buried the truth under layers of bureaucratic lies. The man who had killed her partner and gotten away with it. You're a traitor, she said, her voice flat. You sold out your own country. I'm a pragmatist, Reese replied. The military used me up and threw me away. Why should I feel loyalty to people who never showed any loyalty to me? At least my current employers pay well and don't pretend to care about things like honor and duty. Nathan trusted you. He served under your command. Nathan was a fool. The words came sharp and cold. He thought he could expose me with that little report of his. Thought he could bring me down with paperwork and procedure. He didn't understand that some people are too connected to fall, too valuable to the wrong people in the wrong places. Sarah's grip on her rifle tightened until her knuckles went white. You killed him. I arranged for his death, which is not quite the same thing. The men who actually pulled the triggers were local contractors, just like you. Funny how that works, isn't it? The great American military machine, brought low by its reliance on hired guns. The SEALs were in the ravine now. She could see Sullivan at the entrance, looking back at her, his face creased with confusion about why she had stopped moving. Get them out, she said into her radio, switching to the team frequency. Get them to safety. Don't wait for me. Sullivan hesitated. Contractor, what's happening? Why did you stop? Just go. I'll catch up. She did not know if that was true. She did not know if she would survive the next few minutes. But she knew that Reese was focused on her now. And as long as he was focused on her, he was not focused on the wounded men retreating through the Serpent's Cut. Ah, Sarah. Reese's voice was almost affectionate. Still trying to save everyone? Still believing that one person can make a difference? It's admirable, really, in a naive sort of way. Why tell me any of this, Sarah asked. Why not just kill me and be done with it? Because I want you to know the truth before you die. I want you to understand that everything you've been fighting for these past 3 years was pointless. Nathan died for nothing. His report died with him. And you're about to join him in whatever afterlife you believe in. with the full knowledge that none of it mattered. Sarah scanned the ridges, searching for any sign of Reese's position. He had to be somewhere close, somewhere with a line of sight to the valley. But she could not find him. "You're wrong," she said. "It matters. Every fight matters. Every stand we take against people like you matters." How touching. I'm sure that sentiment will be a great comfort when you're bleeding out on the rocks. A pause. Speaking of which, I think it's time to end this conversation. My men are in position. You've done remarkably well, all things considered. But you're one woman with a rifle, and I have 30 men with instructions to bring me your head. Sarah looked around at the rocks and snow and the steep slopes that surrounded her. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The enemy was on three sides, and the only escape route was through the Serpent's Cut, where Sullivan and his men had gone. She began to move toward the ravine, her rifle ready, her eyes scanning for targets. If she was going to die, she was going to die fighting. She was going to take as many of them with her as possible. "One more thing," Reese said, and his voice had changed, taking on a quality of dark satisfaction that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You should know that Nathan didn't die quickly. He was alive for 3 days after the ambush. 3 days of questions and answers and techniques that would make your stomach turn. He was a strong man, I'll give him that. He didn't break until the very end." Sarah stopped moving. Her vision went red at the edges. "He talked about you at the end. Called your name over and over, like he thought you might hear him, might come to save him. It was pathetic, really, but also rather sweet, in a twisted sort of way." The rage that filled Sarah was unlike anything she had felt before. It was not hot and explosive. It was cold, methodical. The rage of someone who had just discovered a new purpose in life. A clarity of purpose that cut through all the doubt and fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for 3 years. She was going to kill Victor Reese. Not today, perhaps. Not in this valley. But someday, somehow, she was going to find him, and she was going to make him pay for every second of pain he had inflicted on the man she loved. "I'm going to find you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Wherever you run, wherever you hide, I'm going to find you. And when I do, you're going to wish you'd killed me when you had the chance." Reese laughed. "I look forward to watching you try. But for now, I have a schedule to keep. Goodbye, Sarah. Give my regards to Nathan when you see him." The radio went silent, and then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from every direction, converging on Sarah's position with lethal precision. She dove behind a boulder as rounds cracked against the rocks around her, chips of stone flying through the air like shrapnel. The enemy was advancing from the ridges, pouring down into the valley in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm her through sheer numbers. She returned fire, dropping 2, 3, 4 of them before they could reach cover. But there were too many, and they were too close, and her ammunition was running low. A round struck her left shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her against the rock. Pain exploded through her arm, hot and immediate and impossible to ignore. She could feel blood soaking through her sleeve, could feel her grip on the rifle weakening as shock began to set in. But she did not stop fighting. Sarah propped herself against the boulder and kept shooting, each trigger pull an act of defiance against the death that was closing in around her. She dropped another enemy, then another, her shots finding their marks despite the pain and blood loss and the growing darkness at the edges of her vision. And then, just when she was certain the end had come, she heard something that made her heart skip. Gunfire from the Serpent's Cut. Disciplined, controlled, coordinated. The SEALs had returned. Sullivan appeared at the edge of the ravine, his weapon blazing, his men spreading out behind him to lay down suppressive fire. They had not left her. They had regrouped and come back. "Move!" Sullivan shouted. "We'll cover you. Move now!" Sarah forced herself to her feet, her wounded arm hanging useless at her side, her rifle clutched in her remaining hand. She staggered toward the ravine, each step in agony, each meter a small victory against the odds. The SEALs poured fire into the enemy positions, creating a corridor of relative safety that she lurched through with the last reserves of her strength. Hands grabbed her as she reached the entrance, pulling her into the shelter of the rocks, pressing bandages against her wound, shouting questions she could not quite hear over the ringing in her ears. She had made it. Against all odds, she had made it. The last thing she saw before consciousness faded was Sullivan's face, looking down at her with an expression she had never expected to see directed at her. It was gratitude. And it was respect. Consciousness returned to Sarah Morgan in fragments, like shards of broken glass slowly reassembling themselves into a window through which she could see the world again. First came the pain, a throbbing ache in her left shoulder that pulsed with every heartbeat like a drum being struck by an angry hand. Then came the cold, the bone-deep chill of the mountains seeping through the rocks beneath her, wrapping around her body like the embrace of something ancient and indifferent to human suffering. Finally came the sounds, the distant crack of gunfire, the murmur of voices nearby, the howling of wind through the narrow passage where she lay. She opened her eyes. The serpent's cut stretched above her, its walls rising in jagged lines toward a strip of gray sky that seemed impossibly far away. She was lying on a makeshift bed of tactical gear and emergency blankets, her wounded shoulder wrapped in bandages that were already showing spots of red where blood had seeped through the layers of gauze. Someone had propped her rifle against the rock beside her within easy reach, a gesture of respect from men who understood that a soldier without her weapon was only half herself. The air smelled of cordite and blood and the sharp mineral scent of stone. Every breath she took sent a fresh wave of pain through her shoulder. But pain was an old companion, a familiar presence that she had learned to work through rather than fight against. Master Chief Sullivan crouched a few feet away, his back against the ravine wall, his weapon trained on the entrance to the passage with the steady focus of a man who had spent decades learning to wait for death without flinching. His face was drawn with exhaustion and the particular tension of a man who knew the fight was far from over. When he saw her eyes open, something like relief flickered across his weathered features. "You're awake," he said. "Good, we need you." Sarah pushed herself up on her good arm, ignoring the wave of dizziness that washed over her like a tide trying to pull her back under. The world tilted for a moment, the walls of the ravine seeming to lean toward her, then steadied as she forced her body to obey commands it desperately wanted to refuse. She took stock of her surroundings with the quick assessment of someone trained to evaluate tactical situations even when barely conscious. The SEALs had established a defensive position about 50 meters into the ravine, using the natural curves of the rock walls to create overlapping fields of fire. The position was sound, textbook even, the kind of setup that could hold against superior numbers for hours if ammunition held out and morale did not break. The wounded had been gathered in a small alcove near the back of the formation, including Kyle Dawson, whose leg had been properly splinted and bandaged with the professional efficiency of combat medics who had done this work too many times before. He was conscious now, his young face pale but alert, his eyes tracking Sarah with an intensity that had not been there before the ambush. The arrogance was gone. What remained was something harder to define, something that looked like the beginning of wisdom. The rest of the team was spread along the walls, watching the approaches, conserving ammunition, waiting for the next assault they all knew was coming. Their faces showed the strain of combat, the particular weariness that came from fighting for your life while knowing that the odds were stacked against you. But none of them had broken. None of them had given up. They were still SEALs, still warriors, still men who had chosen to stand between their country and those who would do it harm. "How long was I out?" Sarah asked. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Sullivan kept his eyes on the entrance, his weapon never wavering from its position. "Long enough for them to regroup out there. They've got us boxed in. 2 positions at the mouth of the ravine, at least 1 more on the ridge above. Every time we try to push forward, they drive us back with concentrated fire." Sarah processed the information, her tactical mind already working through the possibilities. The serpent's cut was defensible, but it was also a trap. They had cover and concealment, but they had no way out except through enemy positions that had been reinforced since she lost consciousness. "Casualties?" she asked. 2 KIA, Petty Officers Harrison and Mendez. Sullivan's voice was flat, professional, betraying nothing of the loss those names represented. 4 wounded, including you and Dawson. The rest are still combat effective, but we're running low on ammunition. Most of us are down to our last 2 or 3 magazines. 2 dead. Men who had been alive and joking just hours ago. Men who had laughed at her warnings and called her names and believed that their training and their gear and their courage would protect them from anything the enemy could throw at them. Now they lay still in the rocks, their eyes staring at nothing. Their stories ended in a valley far from home. Command says QRF is 90 minutes out, Sullivan continued. Helicopter support delayed by weather over the main valley. There's a storm system moving in from the north, grounding everything that flies. He paused, and for the first time, a note of frustration crept into his voice. We're on our own until then. 90 minutes. An eternity in a firefight. An eternity when you were outnumbered and outgunned and trapped in a narrow ravine with enemies closing in from multiple directions. Sarah reached for her rifle with her good hand, checking the magazine by feel. Half full, maybe 15 rounds. Not enough for 90 minutes of sustained combat against an enemy that seemed to have ammunition to spare. There's something else, Sullivan said, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. The other SEALs were focused on their sectors, maintaining the discipline that kept them alive. But Sullivan had something to say that he did not want them to hear. That transmission you were receiving before you went down, the voice on the radio, who was that? Sarah met his eyes. She saw no point in lying. Not now, not after everything that had happened. Sullivan had earned the truth, and she had learned the hard way that secrets kept too long became poison in the blood. His name is Victor Reese, Major Victor Reese, formerly of the United States Army. He was my commanding officer 3 years ago before I left the service. She paused, the words heavy on her tongue like stones she had been carrying for too long. He's the one who killed my partner. He's the one who set up this ambush. Sullivan's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The look of a man who had just had several pieces of a puzzle click into place, revealing a picture he had suspected but not wanted to see. This was a trap, he said, not for us, for you. Yes, but he's happy to kill all of you as a bonus. Extra credit, you might say. Sarah leaned back against the rock, conserving her strength for what was to come. Reese sold out to the enemy years ago. He was passing information to hostile forces, compromising operations, getting good men killed for money and spite. My partner found out, tried to report it through proper channels. Reese had him killed and buried the evidence under a mountain of official lies. I've been trying to prove it ever since. And now he's here, commanding the forces that are trying to wipe us out. Yes, he came here specifically for me. Used his contacts to arrange for me to be assigned to this mission. Used the ambush as a way to get me into a position where he could finish what he started 3 years ago. Sarah's jaw tightened. Everything that's happened today, all the death and suffering and fear, it's all because of him, because of what he did, because of who he is. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. The wind howled through the ravine, carrying snow crystals that danced in the gray light like tiny ghosts. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. My brother died in Fallujah, he said, 10 years ago. I told you that before, when you were pulling me and my men out of the fire. What I didn't tell you was how he died. He shifted his grip on his weapon, his knuckles white against the black metal. His convoy was ambushed on a route that was supposed to be secure. Intelligence said it was clear, green across the board, no hostile activity expected. But someone had fed bad intel to the enemy. Someone had told them exactly where and when to hit. Sarah understood what he was saying. The same pattern, the same betrayal, the same result. They never found out who did it, Sullivan continued, his voice growing harder with each word. The investigation went nowhere. Every lead dried up. Every witness suddenly had nothing to say. Every piece of evidence pointed in circles that led back to nothing. After a while, they just stopped looking, called it the fog of war, said these things happen, that sometimes the enemy just gets lucky, that we can't win every battle. His eyes met hers, and she saw the anger there, the old wound that had never healed. But I always knew someone had sold them out, someone on our side, someone who wore the same uniform, who took the same oath, who was supposed to have our backs. I could feel it in my gut, but I could never prove it. I'm sorry, Sarah said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Don't be sorry, be angry. Sullivan turned to look at her directly, and there was fire in his eyes now, the same fire that had kept him fighting through 20 years of war. Be angry enough to help me get my men out of here. Be angry enough to survive long enough to make Reese pay for what he's done. Not just to you, not just to your partner, but to all the others, all the soldiers who died because men like him decided that money and power mattered more than honor. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, something that had been dormant since the night Nathan died, a sense of shared purpose, a connection forged in the fire of common loss and common rage. For 3 years, she had carried this burden alone. For 3 years, she had fought this war by herself, against enemies she could not see and allies who would not believe her. Now she had someone standing beside her, someone who understood. "I can do that," she said. Before Sullivan could respond, gunfire erupted at the mouth of the ravine. The SEALs at the forward position opened up immediately, their weapons adding to the cacophony as the enemy launched another probing attack. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, sending chips of stone flying through the narrow passage like deadly confetti. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly before finding her balance. Her left arm was useless, the shoulder wound making it impossible to hold a rifle properly with both hands. But she had spent years training for exactly this kind of situation, learning to shoot with either hand, learning to adapt to injuries that would have ended most soldiers' effectiveness. She moved to a position along the wall, her rifle braced against a natural outcropping that provided both cover and a stable firing platform. Through the narrow gap between two boulders, she could see the entrance to the ravine, could see the muzzle flashes of enemy weapons, could see the shapes of fighters trying to advance through the kill zone the SEALs had established. She took aim with her good hand, compensating for the awkward angle and the tremor that exhaustion had put into her muscles, and fired. A fighter dropped. She adjusted, acquired a new target, fired again. Another fighter fell. The rhythm of combat settled over her like a familiar garment, blocking out the pain and exhaustion and fear, leaving nothing but the pure focus of a predator at work. Each shot was a calculation made flesh, a solution to an equation written in angles and wind speed and the desperate mathematics of survival. The attack faltered, then broke, the surviving enemy fighters retreating back into the rocks to regroup. In the sudden quiet that followed, Sarah could hear the ragged breathing of the men around her, the groans of the wounded, the whistle of wind through the ravine. But she could also hear something else, something that made her blood freeze in her veins. A soft electronic beep, the sound of a message being received on a device that should not exist in this place, where communications were supposed to be secured and encrypted and safe from enemy interception. Sarah turned her head slowly, scanning the SEALs positioned along the ravine walls. Her eyes found what they were looking for almost immediately. Petty Officer Marcus Webb crouched behind a boulder about 10 meters away, his attention focused not on the enemy position, but on a phone clutched in his hands. His thumbs moved across the screen with quick, furtive motions, the movements of someone sending a message they did not want anyone else to see. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of the display, his expression a mixture of fear and desperation that looked nothing like the focused determination of his teammates. Sarah had noticed his behavior during the retreat to the Serpent's Cut. She had filed it away, waiting for confirmation, waiting for the moment when suspicion could become certainty. Now she had it. Webb was the traitor. The realization settled over her with cold certainty. Someone inside the team had been feeding information to the enemy. Someone had known exactly where they would be, exactly when they would arrive, exactly how to set up the ambush that had killed two of his own teammates. And that someone was Webb. Sarah raised her rifle, the motion smooth and unhurried despite the rage building in her chest, like a fire that had been waiting for fuel. She sighted on Webb's center mass, her finger resting against the trigger with the gentle pressure of someone about to deliver justice that was long overdue. "Put the phone down," she said. Her voice carried across the ravine, cutting through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. Every SEAL in the passage turned to look at her, then followed her line of sight to Webb. Webb froze. His eyes went wide, the phone still glowing in his hands, his guilt written across his face as clearly as if it had been tattooed there in bright letters. "I said put it down." Sarah's voice was ice. "Now." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind howled through the ravine, carrying snowflakes that danced and swirled in the gray light. Webb's hands trembled, the phone shaking visibly in his grip. Then Sullivan stepped forward, his weapon trained on Webb's chest, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. The other SEALs shifted as well, their weapons coming around, their expressions transforming from confusion to understanding to rage as they grasped what Webb's behavior meant. "Webb," Sullivan said, and the single word carried more threat than a shouted accusation. "What have you done?" Webb's composure shattered. His face crumpled like paper being crushed in a fist. tears spilling down his cheeks, his body folding in on itself like a structure whose foundations had suddenly given way. "I'm sorry," he gasped, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm sorry I didn't have a choice. They have my family. They have Lisa and the kids. He said if I didn't do what he asked, he would kill them. He sent me pictures. He sent me videos of them tied up in some basement. I couldn't let them die." The words tumbled out in a rush, a confession driven by terror and guilt and the desperate hope that understanding might lead to mercy. Webb dropped the phone, his hands coming up in a gesture of surrender, his whole body shaking with the force of his sobs. "Who?" Sullivan demanded, his voice like a whip. "Who has your family?" "Reese, Major Reese." Webb's voice broke on the name. "He contacted me 2 weeks ago, before we deployed. Said he knew things about my past, things that could destroy my career. He had evidence of a mistake I made years ago, something I thought was buried forever. But that wasn't enough for him. So he took Lisa and the kids from our apartment in Virginia. He sent me proof, pictures of them blindfolded and gagged, a video of Lisa begging me to help them." Webb's face twisted with anguish. "He said if I didn't help him, he would send them back to me in pieces." Sarah lowered her rifle slightly, the rage in her chest giving way to something more complicated. She had expected a traitor. She had expected a villain, someone who had sold out his comrades for money or ideology, or the simple cruelty that some men carried in their hearts. She had not expected this. A man broken by impossible choices, a weapon forged by the same monster who had destroyed her own life. "What did you give him?" she asked. "Everything." Webb's voice was barely a whisper. "Mission plans, route information, timing, frequencies, everything he asked for." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes hollow with despair. "He knew about you. He knew you were assigned to this mission. He said he wanted to be sure you came along. He said he had unfinished business with you that had been waiting 3 years to be resolved." So that was how Reese had known she would be here. Not fate, not coincidence, but carefully arranged betrayal. He had used Webb to ensure that Sarah would be present for the ambush, had manipulated events to bring her to this mountain where he could finally finish what he had started 3 years ago. "My family," Webb said, his voice cracking. "Please, whatever you're going to do to me, please help my family first. They're innocent. Lisa is a school teacher. The kids are 7 and 4. They don't deserve to die because of what I've done." Sullivan looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She understood what he was asking. Webb had betrayed them. Webb's actions had led to the deaths of 2 SEALs, Harrison and Mendez, men who had trusted him with their lives. By any measure of military justice, he deserved to face the consequences of his choices. But Sarah had spent 3 years learning that the world was not divided into simple categories of good and evil. She had learned that good people could be forced into terrible choices by circumstance and desperation. She had learned that monsters like Reese operated by turning their victims into weapons, by finding the pressure points that made ordinary men do extraordinary evil. Webb was not the enemy. Webb was another casualty of Victor Reese's war against everything decent and true. "Where are they being held?" Sarah asked. Webb blinked, surprised by the question. "I don't know exactly. Somewhere in Virginia, near the base. He sends me messages through an encrypted app. I've never been able to trace them back to a location." Sarah turned to Sullivan. "When we get out of here, we need to get word to someone we can trust. Someone who can find Webb's family before Reese realizes his plan has failed." Sullivan's jaw tightened, but after a long moment, he nodded. "Agreed." He looked at Webb, his expression still hard but no longer murderous. "You're going to tell us everything. Every communication, every instruction, every piece of information you passed along. And when this is over, you're going to face whatever consequences come. But first, we're going to try to save your family." Webb collapsed against the rock wall, his body going limp with relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Sarah did not respond. There would be time for thank yous and recriminations later if they survived the next 90 minutes. Right now, they had more immediate problems to deal with. As if on cue, her radio crackled to life with the voice she had hoped never to hear again. "Very touching," Reese said, his tone dripping with mock sentiment. "The noble heroes showing mercy to the traitor in their midst. It's like something out of a bad movie, the kind where everyone learns a valuable lesson and goes home feeling good about themselves." Sarah keyed her transmit button. You're listening to our communications. Of course I am. Did you think I would go to all this trouble and not keep tabs on my investment? A pause filled with satisfaction. I have to say, Webb performed better than I expected. He actually believed I would let his family go if he cooperated. Some people never learn that there's no honor among those who have already sold their souls. Sarah's blood ran cold. What did you do? Nothing yet. His wife and children are still alive, still waiting for Daddy to come home. But they won't wait forever. Reese's voice hardened. Here's how this is going to work, Sarah. You're going to walk out of that ravine alone and unarmed. You're going to surrender yourself to my men, and in exchange, I'll let the SEALs go. I'll even release Webb's family as a gesture of good faith. And if I refuse, then everyone dies. The SEALs, Webb's family, everyone. And I'll make sure you're alive long enough to watch it happen, just like Nathan was alive long enough to know that no one was coming to save him. The mention of Nathan sent a fresh wave of rage through Sarah's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, to think clearly. Reese was offering her a deal. He was also lying. She knew with absolute certainty that he would never let any of them go, regardless of what she did. His word meant nothing. But she also knew that as long as she kept him talking, she was buying time. Time for the QRF to arrive. Time to find another way out of this trap. You went through a lot of trouble to arrange this, she said. Why? You could have had me killed a dozen times over the past 3 years. Why go to all this effort? Reese was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice. Something almost like genuine emotion breaking through the mask of cold amusement. Because I wanted you to understand, he said. I wanted you to know the truth before you died. The truth about Nathan, the truth about me, the truth about everything you've been fighting for these past 3 years. I know the truth. You're a traitor who sold out his country and killed good men to cover your tracks. That's one version of the truth, the version you've been telling yourself to justify your obsession. Would you like to hear another? Reese did not wait for an answer. Did you know that Nathan and I were in the same training class? Back at Benning before you arrived to become the great sniper instructor everyone admires. We were both students under Colonel Hartwell, learning to be the best of the best. Sarah's grip on her rifle tightened. She had not known that. Nathan had never mentioned it, never spoken about his training days except in the most general terms. He was good, Reese continued. I'll give him that. One of the best natural shooters I ever saw. Could read wind like it was whispering secrets in his ear. But he was also arrogant, righteous. The kind of person who believed the rules applied to everyone equally, including people like me who had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to be held back by bureaucratic formalities. What did you do? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. I adjusted some scores, modified some records. Nothing major, just enough to ensure I graduated at the top of the class instead of second place. In the real world, that kind of initiative is rewarded. It's how you get ahead. But Nathan found out. Reese's voice hardened with old anger. He could have looked the other way. He could have understood that some of us needed every advantage we could get. But no, not Nathan Cross. He had to be the hero. He had to file his little report and watch my career burn to the ground. You cheated. You got caught. That's not Nathan's fault. Nathan took everything from me. The composure cracked, revealing the rage beneath, the festering wound that had never healed. I was going to be somebody. I was going to command units, lead operations, make a difference in the world. And he destroyed all of it with a piece of paper and his precious principles. A single report, a few words on a page, and everything I had worked for was gone. Sarah heard the truth in his words, the twisted logic of a man who had convinced himself that he was the victim, that everyone who had held him accountable for his actions was the real enemy. So you joined the other side, she said. You sold information to people who wanted to kill Americans. You had Nathan murdered, all because he reported you for cheating on a training exercise. I found employers who appreciated my talents, people who understood that loyalty has to be earned, not demanded. And yes, I made sure Nathan paid for what he did to me. Reese's voice steadied, the momentary loss of control replaced by cold calculation. He died slowly, Sarah. I made sure of that. 3 days I had him, in a place where no one could hear him scream. 3 days of asking questions he refused to answer, of showing him exactly what happens to people who cross me. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one a hammer strike against the wall she had built around her grief. She had known Nathan was dead. She had not known the full extent of his suffering. She had not known the details of his final hours, the pain he had endured, the desperation he must have felt. He never broke, Reese said, and there was something in his voice that might have been grudging respect. Even at the end, when he had nothing left, when his body was failing and his mind was fading, he never gave me what I wanted. All he did was say your name, over and over, like a prayer, like he thought you might hear him across all those miles. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She would not give Reese the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not let him win this battle of wills, even as her heart shattered into pieces inside her chest. He believed in you, Reese continued. He believed you would find out the truth. He believed you would never stop fighting, never stop searching, never stop trying to bring me down. He was right about that, at least. You've been a thorn in my side for 3 years, asking questions, digging through files, making yourself a nuisance to people who wanted the whole thing forgotten. There was a pause, and when Reese spoke again, his voice was almost soft. But thorns can be removed. And today, finally, I'm going to remove you. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing the grief down, forcing the rage to crystallize into something useful. Cold, focused, deadly. You talk too much, she said. You always did. That's why Nathan caught you cheating in the first place. You couldn't resist bragging about how clever you were. Reese laughed, but there was an edge to it. Maybe so, but clever people also know when to stop talking and start acting. You have 5 minutes to make your decision, Sarah. Walk out of that ravine and surrender, or watch everyone around you die. The radio went silent. Sarah turned to find Sullivan and the rest of the SEALs watching her, their faces grim but determined. They had heard everything. They knew what Reese was demanding. Don't even think about it, Sullivan said. We're not letting you sacrifice yourself for us. He's right, Dawson added, his voice weak but steady. He had dragged himself to a sitting position against the ravine wall, his wounded legs stretched out before him. You saved my life out there. You came down from your position, ran through fire, risked everything to get me to safety. I'm not going to let you throw that away by surrendering to that monster. Sarah looked at them, these men who had mocked her and dismissed her just hours ago. Men who had called her worthless and questioned her competence and laughed at her warnings. Now they were willing to, rather than let her surrender to the enemy who hunted them all. Something shifted inside her. Not just gratitude, though that was part of it. Something deeper. A recognition that for all the darkness in the world, there was also light. There were still people willing to stand together against the night. I'm not going to surrender, she said, and we're not going to die here, but we need a plan and we need it fast. Sullivan nodded, relief flickering across his features. What do you have in mind? Sarah studied the walls of the ravine, the narrow strip of sky above, the positions of the enemy forces she had observed before losing consciousness. Her tactical mind worked through the possibilities, discarding options, refining strategies, searching for the one path that might lead them out of this trap alive. Reese expects me to come out the way we came in, she said. He's got that approach covered with overlapping positions, but this ravine has to lead somewhere. What's at the other end? One of the other SEALs spoke up. It narrows to a gap about 200 meters back, barely wide enough to squeeze through single file. Opens up onto the eastern slope, but it's exposed. Anyone trying to exit that way would be visible from the ridge above. Is the ridge occupied? Unknown. We haven't had time to scout it. Sarah made her decision. Then that's our way out. I'll take the lead, draw their attention and their fire. Give the rest of you time to get through the gap. That's suicide, Sullivan said flatly. Maybe, but it's also our only chance. Sarah checked her rifle again, confirming the ammunition count she already knew. 15 rounds. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to make a difference. Reese is focused on me. He wants me alive, at least for now, so he can finish what he started with Nathan. That gives me an advantage he doesn't realize I have. What advantage? He thinks I'm afraid to die. Sarah met Sullivan's eyes, and something in her gaze made him take a step back. I'm not. I haven't been afraid of death since the night Nathan died in my arms. What I'm afraid of is failing to do what needs to be done, failing to keep the promises I made. She turned to look at Dawson, at Webb, at all the men who were counting on her to get them out of this place alive. I promised Nathan's mother I would find the truth about what happened to her son. I promised Nathan I would never stay silent again. And I'm promising all of you that we're going to survive this day. She raised her rifle, settling it against her good shoulder. Now move. We don't have much time. The SEALs exchanged glances, the silent communication of men who had trained and fought together for years. Then, without a word, they began to move. Those who could walk helped those who could not. Dawson was lifted between two of his teammates, his wounded leg carefully protected. Webb was placed in the middle of the formation, watched but not restrained, his guilt and desperation evident in every line of his body. Sarah took point, moving deeper into the ravine, her eyes scanning the walls and the sky for any sign of enemy presence. The passage narrowed as they advanced, the walls pressing closer, the strip of gray overhead shrinking to a thin ribbon of light. The gap appeared ahead, a vertical crack in the rock face barely wide enough to admit a single person. Beyond it, Sarah could see the eastern slope, a barren expanse of snow and rock that descended toward a valley far below. She studied the terrain, looking for cover, looking for angles, looking for any advantage she could use. Then she turned to Sullivan. "Get them through, I'll buy you time." And before anyone could stop her, she squeezed through the gap and stepped out onto the mountain. The enemy saw her immediately. Gunfire erupted from the ridge above, rounds kicking up snow and stone around her feet. Sarah threw herself into motion, sprinting across the exposed slope, drawing fire away from the gap where Sullivan and his men would emerge. She ran toward death, and death reached for her with fingers of lead and fire. But Sarah Morgan was not ready to die, not yet, not until Reese paid for what he had done. She dove behind a boulder as bullets cracked against stone inches from her head. The impact of her landing sent fresh waves of pain through her wounded shoulder. But she ignored it, forcing her body to obey commands it desperately wanted to refuse. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see the ridge above, could see the muzzle flashes of enemy weapons lighting up the gray morning like malevolent stars, could see the shapes of fighters repositioning, trying to get better angles on her position. And there, standing apart from the others, she could see a figure that made her heart stop. Reese. He stood on an outcropping about 400 meters away, just far enough to be out of reliable range for most shooters. He held what looked like a radio in one hand, and even at this distance she could sense his arrogance, his certainty that he was untouchable, that this was all going according to his plan. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs beginning to push through the gap, their movements careful but urgent. Sullivan was directing the evacuation, his voice low but steady, keeping his men moving even as bullets continued to rain down from above. Sarah had to give them time. She had to keep Reese and his men focused on her, away from the gap where the team was emerging onto the slope. She shifted her position, finding a stable platform for her rifle despite the awkward angle forced by her wounded arm. The wind howled around her, carrying snow crystals that stung her exposed skin and threatened to obscure her vision. 400 meters, edge of her effective range under normal circumstances. Well beyond it with one arm and a gusting wind. But Sarah had made impossible shots before. She had spent a lifetime training for moments exactly like this one. And she had something driving her that went beyond training, beyond skill, beyond even the survival instinct that kept most people alive. She had a promise to keep. Reese raised his radio, probably to deliver another taunt, another threat, another piece of poison designed to break her spirit before he broke her body. Sarah breathed out slowly, feeling her heartbeat steady, feeling the world narrow to the single point of focus that had defined her life for as long as she could remember. She thought of Nathan. She thought of Margaret Cross waiting in her farmhouse in Montana. She thought of the folded paper she carried next to her heart, the draft report that Nathan had written 3 days before his death. She thought of the promise she had made, never stay silent, never let them win. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and 400 meters away, Reese's radio exploded in his hand. He staggered backward, dropping to one knee, clutching his hand where the bullet had torn through metal and flesh. It was not a kill shot. At this range, with this wind, with one arm, she had not been able to guarantee a kill shot, but it was enough. Reese was wounded. Reese was bleeding. Reese was no longer untouchable. And Sarah Morgan was just getting started. She cycled the bolt and took aim again, ready to finish what Nathan had started 3 years ago. The shot echoed across the mountain like the crack of judgment itself, and 400 meters away, Victor Reese stumbled backward with blood streaming from his hand, where Sarah Morgan's bullet had torn through the radio and into flesh. The device exploded into fragments of plastic and metal and circuitry, scattering across the snow like the broken pieces of his carefully constructed plan. The blood that followed painted a dark stain against the white powder, a mark that would not be easily erased. For one perfect moment, time seemed to freeze. Sarah watched through her scope as Reese clutched his wounded hand to his chest, as his men scrambled for cover around him like ants whose hill had been kicked. As the arrogance that had defined every word he spoke transformed into something closer to shock and disbelief. He had not expected this. He had not expected her to fight back with such precision. He had not expected that the woman he had dismissed as a nuisance, a broken remnant of the partner he had destroyed, could reach out across 400 meters of wind and snow and gravity and touch him with the same violence he had inflicted on so many others. Then time resumed its normal course, and the mountain exploded into chaos. Enemy fighters poured fire down from the ridge, their bullets kicking up snow and stone around Sarah's position in a deadly hailstorm of lead. She pressed herself against the boulder, making her body as small as possible while still maintaining a sight line on the slope above. The rocks shuddered with each impact, chips of granite flying through the air like shrapnel, the sound of ricochets filling the air with their angry whine. Through the narrow gap in the rocks, she could see Reese being dragged backward by two of his men, could see the blood trail he left in the snow like a crimson breadcrumb path, could see the fury twisting his features even as he retreated to relative safety. His voice came through the radio one final time, distorted by a backup device, stripped of the smooth confidence that had characterized every word he had spoken before. "Kill her! Kill them all! I want their bodies left on this mountain as a message." The order galvanized his forces. Fighters began moving down from the ridge, advancing from cover to cover with the coordinated precision of men who had done this many times before. They were coming for her. They were coming for all of them. Behind Sarah, the SEALs were pushing through the gap in the rock face, emerging onto the eastern slope one by one. Sullivan appeared first, his weapon up and scanning, his body moving with the fluid efficiency of a man who had spent 2 decades learning to navigate the chaos of combat. He took in the situation with a single glance, saw Sarah pinned behind the boulder, saw the enemy positions on the ridge, saw the fighters advancing down the slope, and made his decision in less than a heartbeat. "Covering fire," he shouted, and the SEALs who had already emerged spread out along the slope, their weapons blazing, creating a wall of suppressive fire that forced the enemy to duck behind their own cover. Sarah used the moment to move, sprinting from her boulder to a cluster of rocks 30 meters to the south. Bullets chased her across the open ground, kicking up snow at her heels, cracking past her head close enough that she could feel the displacement of air against her skin. But the enemy's aim was disrupted by the fire coming from Sullivan's team, and she reached cover without taking a hit. She was not so lucky on her second move. The enemy had adjusted to the covering fire from Sullivan's team, finding angles that let them engage while staying protected from the SEALs' weapons. Sarah watched a fighter take position behind a boulder on the eastern slope, his rifle tracking her movement across the open ground. She knew she was in his sights. She knew the mathematics of bullet trajectory meant she had perhaps 2 seconds before he found a shot. She dove to the side just as his weapon cracked, the round passing through the space her chest had occupied a heartbeat earlier. But her dive carried her into the open, away from the cover she had been heading toward, exposing her to other fighters who had been waiting for exactly this moment. As she pushed toward another position, trying to maintain the gap between herself and the SEALs to keep the enemy's attention divided, a round caught her in the left thigh. The impact was like being hit with a sledgehammer, the force of it spinning her around and dropping her to one knee in the snow. Pain exploded through her leg, hot and immediate and impossible to ignore, radiating outward from the wound in waves that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. She could feel blood soaking through her pants, warm against her skin despite the freezing temperature. She could feel her leg threatening to buckle beneath her weight, the muscles damaged beyond their capacity to support her. She could feel the darkness at the edges of her vision, the blood loss from this wound combining with the earlier shoulder injury to push her body toward its absolute limits. But Sarah Morgan had been hurt before. She had been hurt worse than this and kept fighting, kept moving, kept refusing to give up when everything inside her screamed for surrender. She had learned long ago that pain was just information, just another factor to be processed and accommodated in the endless calculations of survival. She forced herself up, using her rifle as a crutch, and limped toward cover. Behind her, she heard Dawson's voice, surprisingly strong despite his own wound. "She's hit! Cover her! Cover her!" More fire erupted from the SEAL positions, a coordinated barrage that drove the advancing enemy back into their holes. Sarah made it to the rocks just as another burst of enemy fire tore through the space she had occupied moments before, the rounds close enough that she could feel their passage like hot breath against her neck. She collapsed against the stone, her breathing ragged, her vision graying at the edges from blood loss and exhaustion and the accumulated strain of the longest hours of her life. Blood pooled beneath her, darkening the snow, marking her position for anyone watching from above. But she was alive, and the team was moving. Through the chaos of the firefight, she could see Sullivan directing his men with the calm authority that came from decades of experience. He moved among them like a conductor directing an orchestra, placing fire where it was needed, shifting positions to cover gaps in their defense, keeping his men moving even as bullets continued to rain down from the ridge above. The wounded were being carried by their mobile teammates. Dawson supported between two SEALs who refused to leave him behind despite the weight and the danger. Webb was among them, his face a mask of guilt and determination as he helped carry ammunition to the forward positions. Whatever judgment awaited him would come later. For now, he was still one of them, still fighting, still trying to make amends for the betrayal that had brought them to this mountain. Sarah should have been with them. She should have been retreating toward the valley, conserving her strength, waiting for the QRF that was still somewhere between here and salvation. Every principle of tactical withdrawal told her to fall back, to let the team cover her, to focus on survival rather than vengeance. Instead, she turned and began climbing toward the ridge. Her legs screamed in protest with every step, the wound in her thigh tearing wider as she forced muscles to work that had been damaged beyond their normal capacity. Her shoulder throbbed in sympathy, the earlier wound having reopened during her movements across the slope. Blood left a trail behind her in the snow, a red path that marked her progress up the mountain like a sacrifice offered to gods who had long since stopped listening to the prayers of soldiers. But she kept climbing. She had to find Reese. She had to end this, one way or another. 3 years of searching, 3 years of questions without answers, 3 years of carrying the Nathan's memory like a weight that never grew lighter. It all came down to this moment, this mountain, this final confrontation with the man who had destroyed everything she loved. The enemy fire had shifted, concentrating on the retreating SEALs rather than the wounded woman climbing toward their position. They had made the calculation that she was no longer a threat, that a limping figure with 2 bleeding wounds could not possibly reach them before the rest of her team was eliminated. She was already dead in their minds, a problem that would solve itself without any additional expenditure of ammunition. They were wrong. Sarah used their mistake, moving from cover to cover, working her way up the ridge with the patient determination of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to endure. The pain became a distant thing, a background noise that her mind had learned to filter out. The cold became irrelevant. The exhaustion became fuel, transmuted by rage and grief and the desperate need to see this through to the end. She thought about Nathan as she climbed. She thought about the first time they met at Fort Benning, when he was just another arrogant young soldier who thought his talent made him invincible. She remembered his smile, cocky and confident, the smile of someone who had never been truly tested and assumed he never would be. She remembered the way his expression changed when she showed him the limits of his knowledge, the humility that replaced the arrogance, the hunger to learn that emerged from the ashes of his pride. She thought about the months of training that followed, the long hours on the range where he absorbed everything she could teach him. She remembered him staying late after the other students had gone, practicing the techniques she demonstrated until his hands blistered and bled. She remembered the first time he made a shot she could not have made herself. The pride that filled her chest, the recognition that the student had begun to surpass the teacher in ways that made her better, rather than diminished. She thought about the conversations that stretched into the night, talking about everything and nothing, the way two people do when they are falling in love, but neither is willing to name what is happening between them. She remembered the night he finally kissed her, under the Georgia stars, with the smell of cordite still lingering in the air from a day on the range. She remembered the fear that came with loving someone in their profession, the knowledge that every mission could be the last, the way they both pushed that fear aside because the alternative was never living at all. She thought about the missions they had run together, the impossible shots they had made, the lives they had saved, and the enemies they had neutralized. She remembered lying beside him in hides across 3 continents, their breathing synchronized, their heartbeats aligned, 2 people operating as a single instrument of precision and purpose. She remembered the way he made her laugh during the long hours of waiting, the jokes he told that had no right being funny, but made her smile anyway. She thought about the way he laughed, full and genuine, the sound of someone who had found joy in a profession that offered mostly hardship. She thought about the way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if every word she said mattered more than anything else in the world. She thought about the way he always knew exactly what to say when the weight of their work threatened to crush her spirit, the right words at the right moment that reminded her why they did what they did. She thought about the last time she saw him, standing on the tarmac at Bagram, his pack slung over one shoulder, his smile as bright as the Afghan sun. He had told her he loved her. He had told her he would see her in 2 weeks. He had kissed her goodbye and walked toward the helicopter that would carry him to his death. She thought about the notification officer who came to her quarters 3 days later, his face carefully arranged in the professional sympathy that military personnel learned to wear like a mask. She thought about the words he spoke, the standard phrases about sacrifice and service that were supposed to provide comfort, but only made the loss feel more abstract, more official, more impossible to grieve. She thought about the funeral at Arlington, the folded flag, the rifle volley, the bugler playing taps as Nathan's coffin was lowered into the ground. She thought about Margaret Cross, Nathan's mother, standing beside her with tears streaming down her face, asking questions that no one seemed willing to answer. She thought about the 3 years that followed, the investigation that went nowhere, the documents that were always classified, the witnesses who suddenly had nothing to say. She thought about the official report that blamed Nathan for his own death, the lie that had been accepted as truth by everyone except her. And she thought about the promise she had made to him, to Margaret, to herself, the promise to never stay silent, the promise to never let them win, the promise to find the truth no matter how long it took or how much it cost. She was 200 meters from Reese's position when her radio crackled to life. Sarah. His voice was different now. The smooth confidence was gone, replaced by something ragged and raw. The voice of a man who was wounded, who was losing control, who was watching his carefully constructed plan fall apart around him. You shot me. You actually shot me. She did not respond. She needed her breath for climbing. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I didn't think you had it in you. Nathan always said you were capable of anything when properly motivated, but I assumed he was exaggerating. People in love always exaggerate. A pause filled with something that might have been pain or might have been bitter amusement. He loved you, you know, really loved you. Not just the surface attraction that most people mistake for love, but the deep, consuming kind that changes who you are at the fundamental level. Sarah's hand tightened on her rifle. She was 150 meters away now, close enough to see individual shapes moving among the rocks above, close enough to hear the shouts of Reese's men as they prepared to evacuate their wounded commander. He talked about you constantly during those 3 days, Reese continued. In between the sessions where I asked him questions and he refused to answer, your name was like a prayer in his mouth, Sarah, over and over, Sarah, like he thought saying it enough times would somehow summon you, would somehow make you appear to save him from what was happening. 100 meters. Sarah could see the outcropping where Reese had been standing when she shot him, could see the blood staining the snow around it, could see figures crouched behind rocks, weapons ready, waiting for her to come into view. But you never came, did you? You were back at base, following orders, being a good little soldier while he screamed for you in the dark. You didn't even know he was alive. You thought he died in the ambush, quick and clean and painless. You had no idea he was in my hands for 3 days, begging for death, while I took my time showing him exactly what happens to people who try to destroy me. 70 meters. Sarah could hear voices now, orders being shouted in a mixture of English and local dialect. The enemy was preparing to fall back, to evacuate their wounded commander before the situation deteriorated further. She could see Reese himself sitting against a rock while one of his men wrapped his wounded hand in a bandage, his face a mask of fury and pain. Do you want to know what his last words were? His real last words, not the sanitized version that got put in the official report. Reese's voice dropped to something almost intimate, almost tender. He said your name one final time, but it wasn't a prayer anymore. It was a prophecy. He looked at me with those eyes that wouldn't break no matter what I did to them. And he said, Sarah will find the truth over and over like a chant. Sarah will find the truth. Sarah will find the truth. Sarah will find the truth. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each repetition driving deeper into her heart than any bullet could reach. Nathan's final moments spent thinking of her. Nathan's final words, an expression of faith that she would uncover what had been buried. Nathan's final act of defiance, telling his murderer that the truth would come out no matter how hard he tried to hide it. She stopped climbing. Her leg gave out beneath her, no longer capable of supporting her weight, and she collapsed to her knees in the snow. Her vision blurred with tears she could no longer hold back. Her body began to shake, not from cold or exhaustion or pain, but from the overwhelming weight of grief that she had carried for 3 years and never fully allowed herself to feel. Nathan had believed in her. Even at the end, even when hope was impossible, even when death was the only certainty remaining, he had believed that she would not give up, that she would keep searching, that she would find the truth and make it known. And she had. Here, on this mountain, surrounded by enemies who wanted her dead, she had finally found the truth. Reese had confessed. The pieces had fallen into place. Nathan's faith had been justified. But the cost, the terrible, terrible cost. Sarah sank forward, her hands pressing into the snow, her tears falling onto the frozen ground where they crystallized into tiny drops of ice. The rifle slipped from her grasp, landing beside her with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. The grief that she had suppressed for 3 years came pouring out of her in great, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She had not cried like this since the night she learned Nathan was dead. She had not allowed herself to cry, had not given herself permission to feel, because feeling meant acknowledging the depth of her loss and the enormity of her failure. She had channeled everything into the search for truth, had used anger and determination as shields against the grief that threatened to consume her. Now those shields were gone, shattered by Reese's words, by the revelation that Nathan had died still believing in her, still speaking her name, still refusing to break even as his body failed. She had failed to save him. She had failed to see the danger before it was too late. She had failed to be there when he needed her most. And now, when she finally had the chance to avenge him, when she was so close to the man who had murdered him, her body refused to go any further. The wounds were too severe, the blood loss too great, the weight of grief too heavy. She was going to die here on this mountain without ever seeing justice done. Then a hand touched her shoulder. Sarah looked up, expecting an enemy, expecting the barrel of a gun pointed at her face, expecting the end that had been chasing her since the moment she stepped onto this mountain. Instead, she found Sullivan. He was breathing hard from the climb, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, and the particular exhaustion that came from leading men through impossible situations. His weapon hung at his side, his hands empty except for the one resting on her shoulder. Behind him, she could see Dawson being supported by 2 other SEALs, could see the rest of the team taking up defensive positions around them, their weapons pointed outward toward the enemy positions. They had not retreated, they had not left her behind, they had followed her up the mountain. "We don't leave people behind," Sullivan said, as if reading her thoughts. "That's what you taught us today. That's what you showed us when you came down from your ridge to save Dawson. When you could have stayed safe and watched us die. And that's what we're going to do now." He crouched beside her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that cut through her grief like a blade. "My brother died in Fallujah because someone betrayed his unit. For 10 years I've carried that weight, not knowing who did it, not being able to do anything about it. I've watched his kids grow up without a father. I've held his wife when she cried on the anniversary of his death. I've stood at his grave and promised him that somehow, someday, I would find the truth." Sullivan's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion Sarah had seen from him since the ambush began. "But you never stopped fighting. You never gave up. 3 years you've been hunting Reese, following leads that went nowhere, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. And now you've found the truth, not just about Nathan, but about all of them, all the soldiers who died because of men like Reese. He paused, gathering himself. My brother's killer is still out there somewhere. I don't know if I'll ever find him, but today, right now, we're going to make sure Nathan's killer faces justice. We're going to finish what you started, and maybe, just maybe, that will be enough to start healing some of the wounds that men like Reese have left on all of us. He reached down and pulled her to her feet, slinging her arm over his shoulder to take the weight off her wounded leg. Another SEAL appeared on her other side, providing additional support. Reese is up there, Sarah said, her voice cracked and broken. He's getting away. No, Sullivan replied, he's not. He nodded toward the ridge, and Sarah followed his gaze. Through the swirling snow, she could see something she had not noticed before. Movement on the western slope. Figures in American uniforms, advancing toward Reese's position from a direction he had not anticipated. The precision of their movement, the coordination of their advance, marked them as professionals. Special operations, the QRF that had been 90 minutes away. They arrived 10 minutes ago, Sullivan explained, landed on the far side of the ridge when the weather cleared enough for a window. They've been working their way around to flank Reese's position while we kept him busy from this side. He's trapped now, caught between us and them. Sarah stared at the advancing soldiers, scarcely able to believe what she was seeing. They were not going to die here. They were not going to let Reese escape. The cavalry had arrived, and for the first time since the ambush began, the odds had shifted decisively in their favor. Can you make it a little further? Sullivan asked. I think you've earned the right to see how this ends. Sarah nodded, gathering the fragments of her strength. I can make it. Together with Sullivan on one side and another SEAL on the other, they climbed the final distance to the ridge. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos and surrender. Reese's men were being rounded up by the QRF soldiers, their weapons confiscated, their hands secured behind their backs with zip ties. Some had tried to fight and lay motionless in the snow, their blood darkening the white powder around them. Others had recognized the futility of resistance and given up without a struggle, kneeling with their hands behind their heads while soldiers searched them for hidden weapons. And there in the center of it all stood Victor Reese. He was on his knees, his wounded hand wrapped in a bloody bandage, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Two soldiers flanked him, their weapons trained on his head, ready to fire at the first sign of resistance. He looked smaller than Sarah had imagined, diminished somehow by the circumstances of his capture. The monster who had haunted her nightmares for 3 years was just a man after all, a man who had made choices that led him here, to his knees in the snow, surrounded by the soldiers of the nation he had betrayed. When he saw Sarah approaching, supported by Sullivan and the other SEAL, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not exactly. Something more complex. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement that the prophecy Nathan had spoken with his dying breath had come true. Sarah will find the truth. She had found it, and now she was here, standing over the man who had murdered her partner, with the power to decide his fate. Let me go, she said to Sullivan. He hesitated, his grip tightening on her arm. You can barely stand. I need to do this. I need to face him alone. Sullivan studied her for a long moment, searching her face for something he apparently found, because he nodded and released his support. Sarah swayed but did not fall. She forced her wounded leg to bear her weight, forced her body to obey commands it desperately wanted to refuse. Step by painful step, she walked toward Reese until she stood directly in front of him. He looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind howled around them, carrying snow crystals that danced and swirled in the gray light. The soldiers holding Reese watched in silence, sensing the weight of the moment, the history that hung between these two people who had been circling each other for 3 years without ever meeting face to face. You found the truth, Reese said finally. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the smooth confidence that had characterized every word he had spoken over the radio. Nathan was right about you after all. Sarah reached down and drew her sidearm from its holster. The motion was slow, deliberate, giving Reese time to understand what was happening. She raised the weapon and pressed the barrel against his forehead, feeling the cold metal contact his skin, watching his eyes widen slightly at the pressure. I could kill you right now, she said. Her voice was steady, calm, utterly devoid of the emotion that had overwhelmed her moments ago. No one would blame me. You killed my partner. You killed good men. You sold out your country to people who want to destroy everything we stand for. I could pull this trigger and call it justice. Reese's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. He was waiting, measuring, trying to calculate whether she would actually do it. For 3 years, I have dreamed of this moment, of finding you, of making you pay for what you did to Nathan. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, just slightly, just enough for Reese to feel the weapon shift against his skull. I could end you right now, and it would feel like justice. It would feel like closure. It would feel like keeping the promise I made to Nathan as he died in my arms. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. The soldiers watched, motionless. Sullivan held his breath. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what Sarah Morgan would do. Then slowly she lowered the weapon. But that's not what Nathan would want, she said. He believed in the system, even when it failed him. He believed in truth and justice and the rule of law, even when that law was used to cover up his murder. He believed that people like you should face trial, should have their crimes exposed for the world to see, should answer for what they've done in a court of law rather than at the end of a bullet in the snow. She holstered the sidearm and looked down at Reese with something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might have been both. You're going to prison, Victor. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell, knowing that everyone knows what you did, the men you served with, the country you betrayed, the families of everyone you got killed with your greed and your spite. They're all going to know the truth. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. Nathan's mother is going to know. Margaret Cross is going to read about your trial, and she's going to know that her son didn't die because of tactical miscalculation. She's going to know that he died because you were too weak to accept the consequences of your own actions. She's going to know that he never broke, never gave you what you wanted, never stopped believing that the truth would come out. And she's going to know that her son was right. Sarah straightened up, looking down at the man who had taken everything from her. That's the justice Nathan deserves. Not a quick death on a mountain. A long public reckoning for every life you destroyed. She turned away from him and walked back toward Sullivan. Each step an agony, each movement a triumph of will over broken flesh. When she reached him, she allowed herself to lean against his support once more. The strength that had carried her through the confrontation finally giving way to the reality of her wounds. It's over, she said. It's finally over. Sullivan nodded, his expression a mixture of respect and something that looked almost like awe. Yes, it is. As if on cue, the sound of helicopter rotors reached them from the valley below. More birds were coming, medevac and transport, ready to carry the wounded to safety and the prisoners to justice. The storm that had delayed the QRF had broken, and patches of blue sky were appearing through the gray clouds overhead. For the first time in hours, the sun broke through, casting golden light across the snow-covered ridge. Sarah lifted her face toward its warmth, feeling it against her skin like a blessing after a long, dark night. She had kept her promise. She had found the truth. She had brought Nathan's killer to justice. The helicopters landed on the ridge, their rotors kicking up snow and swirling clouds that momentarily obscured everything. Medics rushed toward the wounded, their training taking over as they triaged injuries and began the urgent work of stabilization. As they worked on Sarah's wounds, she saw a figure approaching through the chaos. A man with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform. He moved with the quiet authority of a senior officer, the kind of presence that made everyone around him stand a little straighter without being told. Behind him walked two aides, but he moved as if alone, his attention focused entirely on the wounded woman being treated by the medics. When he reached her, he stopped and looked down at her with eyes that held a mixture of concern and something that looked remarkably like pride. Those eyes were familiar. She had seen them before, in photographs on Nathan's desk, in the memories he shared of his training days. "Staff Sergeant Morgan," Colonel James Hartwell said, "I've been looking for you for a very long time." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice weak from exhaustion and blood loss. "Don't try to talk," Hartwell said, kneeling beside her. "There will be time for that later. Right now, I just want you to know something." He leaned closer, his voice dropping so that only she could hear. "I trained Nathan. I trained him and Reese both back at Benning. When Nathan sent that report about Reese cheating, I was the one who received it. I was the one who initiated the investigation that ended Reese's career in the regular military." Hartwell's face tightened with old regret. "I should have done more. I should have watched him more closely. I should have seen what he was becoming. But I didn't, and good men died because of my failure." Sarah managed to shake her head slightly. It was not his fault. It was Reese's fault. Only Reese's. When Nathan was killed, I knew something was wrong, Hartwell continued. The official report didn't make sense. Nathan was too good, too careful to make the kind of mistakes they claimed. I started investigating, quietly, trying to find proof of what I suspected. But Reese had friends in high places, and every lead I followed turned into a dead end. He placed his hand over hers, his grip gentle but firm. Then I heard about you, the contractor who wouldn't stop asking questions, the woman who refused to accept the official story. I've been tracking your investigation for 2 years, Sarah. Every document you requested, every interview you conducted, every door that was slammed in your face. And I've been quietly opening other doors, gathering evidence, building a case that even Reese's friends won't be able to bury. Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. The QRF that saved you today wasn't a coincidence. I've had people watching for any sign of Reese's activities. When we intercepted communications about an operation in this sector, I made sure to be in command of the response force. I didn't know you would be here, but I knew Reese would be. And I knew that if I could catch him in the act, all those years of quiet investigation would finally pay off. Hartwell smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw the warmth beneath the military bearing. You did what I couldn't do, Sarah. You brought him into the open. You made him reveal himself. You did what Nathan always believed you would do. He squeezed her hand. Rest now. When you wake up, we'll talk about what comes next. About the court-martial that's going to expose every crime Reese committed. About the families who are finally going to get the answers they deserve. About Nathan's mother, who's going to learn that her son was a hero, not a failure. Sarah tried to respond, but the darkness was rising up to claim her now. The accumulated toll of her wounds finally overwhelming her ability to fight. The last thing she saw before consciousness faded was Hartwell's face, weathered by years of service, marked by the same loss and sacrifice that had defined her own life. He had been Nathan's instructor. He had been watching over her investigation all along. And now, somehow, he was here at the end of this long journey, ready to help her navigate whatever came next. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, secure in the knowledge that she had kept her promise, that she had honored Nathan's memory, that she had proven worthy of the faith he had placed in her with his dying breath. Sarah will find the truth. She had found it, and the truth had set them all free. Sarah Morgan opened her eyes to the sound of machines beeping in steady rhythm and the sharp antiseptic smell that marked every military hospital she had ever known. The ceiling above her was white and featureless, the kind of institutional blankness designed to be inoffensive and ended up being depressing instead. Fluorescent lights hummed somewhere overhead, their artificial glow a pale imitation of the sun. She remembered breaking through the clouds on that mountain ridge, what felt like a lifetime ago. For a long moment she lay still, taking inventory of her body the way she had learned to do after every engagement that ended with her in a medical facility. Her left shoulder ached with the deep, throbbing pain of healing tissue, the kind of pain that told her the surgeons had done their work, but the real mending was still in progress. Her left thigh was wrapped in bandages she could feel pressing against her skin beneath the hospital blanket, tight enough to restrict movement, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Her head felt stuffed with cotton, the lingering effect of whatever painkillers they had given her during surgery and the days of unconsciousness that followed. But she was alive, against all odds, against all expectations, against every calculation of probability that said a wounded woman climbing toward enemy positions should have been cut down long before she reached her target. She was alive. The memories came flooding back in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly reassembling themselves into a coherent image. The mountain, the ambush, the screams of the SEALs as the trap was sprung, her first shot from the ridge, the machine gunner dropping like a puppet whose strings had been cut, the desperate climb down through enemy fire to reach Kyle Dawson, the confrontation with Webb when his betrayal was revealed, Reese's voice on the radio, taunting her with the details of Nathan's death, trying to break her spirit before he broke her body. She remembered the climb toward his position, her legs screaming with every step, her shoulder throbbing, her blood leaving a trail in the snow that marked her passage like a sacrifice offered to gods who had long since stopped listening to the prayers of soldiers. She remembered the shot that destroyed his radio and wounded his hand, the first time she had touched him with the violence he had visited upon so many others. She remembered the confrontation on the ridge, the gun pressed against his forehead, the choice she had made to seek justice rather than vengeance. And she remembered Hartwell, appearing through the chaos like a figure from a dream she had forgotten she was having, speaking words she could barely recall, but whose meaning had stayed with her even through the darkness of unconsciousness. She turned her head and found she was not alone in the small hospital room. Kyle Dawson sat in a chair beside her bed, his wounded leg propped up on a footstool, a paperback book open in his lap that he did not seem to be reading. He looked different than he had on the mountain. The arrogance that had defined him during those first hours of the mission, the cocky confidence that had led him to mock her warnings and dismiss her expertise, was gone. In its place was something quieter and more thoughtful, the look of a young man who had seen the world shift beneath his feet and was still trying to find his balance. His face bore the marks of the ordeal they had survived together, scratches and bruises that would heal in time, and shadows behind his eyes that might take longer to fade. He was wearing hospital scrubs like hers, his wounded leg bandaged beneath the thin fabric, but he had pulled a chair close to her bed and was clearly keeping watch, waiting for her to wake. When he saw her looking at him, he closed the book and leaned forward, his expression shifting from the distant focus of someone lost in thought to the immediate attention of someone who cared about what happened next. "You're awake," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, scraped raw by exhaustion in the aftermath of too much screaming and too little sleep. "The doctor said you might sleep for another day at least. They weren't sure how much blood you lost up there." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice a ragged whisper that barely made it past her lips. Dawson reached for a cup of water on the bedside table and held it so she could drink through a straw. The cool liquid felt like heaven against her parched throat, washing away the taste of dust and blood and the metallic tang of fear that still lingered in her mouth. "How long?" she managed after a moment. 3 days. They flew us to Bagram first, stabilized everyone who needed stabilizing, then transported the worst cases to Landstuhl in Germany. "You're there now." He gestured vaguely at the walls around them. "Best military hospital in Europe, they tell me. You're stable now, but they want to keep you here for at least another week before they'll clear you for transport back to the States." He set the cup down and settled back in his chair, his movements careful and deliberate, the movements of someone who had learned that recklessness had consequences. "Sullivan's been in and out, the rest of the team too. They wanted to make sure you knew they were here, that they were thinking about you." He paused, his expression complicated. "We all wanted you to know that." Sarah absorbed this information, her mind still foggy from the drugs and the trauma and the weight of everything that had happened. 3 days. 3 days since the mountain, since the confrontation with Reese, since everything she had been working toward for 3 years had finally come to a head. "Reese?" she asked. "In custody. Military police took him off the ridge in chains, wrapped his wounded hand in bandages, and flew him to a secure facility pending court-martial." Dawson's expression hardened, the softness giving way to something colder. "Colonel Hartwell has been building a case against him for years, apparently. With the evidence from this operation, the testimony from Webb about the blackmail and the communications, and Reese's own confessions on the radio that were recorded by our comms gear, there's no way he's getting out of this. The lawyers are already talking about life without parole. The bastard is going to spend the rest of his miserable existence in a military prison." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension that had been there so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Reese was going to face justice. Nathan's death was going to be avenged, not through the quick satisfaction of a bullet, but through the slow, thorough process of law that would expose every crime he had committed for the world to see. "And Webb?" she asked. Dawson's expression grew more complicated, the hardness softening into something that looked almost like compassion. "That's still being sorted out. He cooperated fully once we got off the mountain. Gave up everything about his communications with Reese, the blackmail, the threats against his family, the encrypted apps they used to communicate. The MPs found his wife and kids in a basement in Virginia, just like he said. They were scared and dehydrated and traumatized, but physically unharmed." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I don't know what's going to happen to him. He betrayed us. That's a fact that can't be changed. His actions led to Harrison and Mendez dying, led to all of us nearly dying. By any measure of military justice, he should face consequences for that." Dawson shook his head slowly. "But he was also a victim. Reese manipulated him, threatened his family, put him in an impossible position where every choice was wrong. The lawyers are going to have to figure out where the line is between what he chose to do and what he was forced to do. He paused, then added something that surprised Sarah. Colonel Hartwell testified on his behalf yesterday, told the review board that Webb's cooperation after the ambush was instrumental in building the case against Reese, said the intelligence Webb provided about Reese's network has already led to 3 more arrests. Dawson's expression softened slightly. The board is recommending a reduced sentence, dishonorable discharge instead of prison time, given the coercion and his cooperation. His family is back home now, safe. His kids are back in school. He met Sarah's eyes and she saw the conflict there, the struggle to reconcile justice with mercy. I'm not sure how I feel about it, he admitted. Part of me wants to hate him for what he did, for the deaths he caused, or for the trust he violated. Part of me understands why he did it, why any of us might have done the same if someone had our family. If someone threatened to hurt the people I loved most in the world. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Sarah understood the conflict. She had felt it herself on the mountain, when Webb's guilt was revealed and she had to decide whether to see him as a traitor or a tool, a villain or a victim. In the end, she had chosen to see him as human, as someone who had been broken by impossible circumstances and deserved a chance at redemption. She hoped the military justice system would find a way to do the same. The door to her room opened, and Colonel James Hartwell stepped inside. He looked much as he had on the mountain, silver hair beneath a military cover, posture straight despite the years of service that had carved themselves into his face like lines on a map. But there was something different in his eyes now, a warmth that had been hidden before by the urgency of the situation and the need to project command presence in a crisis. Staff Sergeant Morgan, he said, it's good to see you awake. The doctors were starting to worry. Dawson stood, gathering his book, recognizing that this was a conversation that needed to happen in private. I'll be outside if you need anything, he said to Sarah, then nodded respectfully to Hartwell before limping out of the room and closing the door behind him. Hartwell took the chair Dawson had vacated, settling into it with the careful movements of a man whose body bore the accumulated wear of decades in the field. He had been shot and stabbed and blown up and beaten over the course of 30 years in special operations, and every one of those injuries had left its mark. But his eyes were clear and sharp, the eyes of a man who had never stopped paying attention to the world around him. For a moment, he simply looked at her, studying her face as if searching for something he needed to find. I owe you an explanation, he said finally, about what happened on that mountain and about everything that led up to it. You deserve to know the full truth, not the sanitized version that's going to appear in the official reports. Sarah waited, her curiosity cutting through the fog of medication. I told you before that I trained Nathan and Reese both, back at Benning. They were in the same class years ago, 2 young soldiers with exceptional talent and very different characters. Nathan was gifted, maybe the most naturally talented shooter I ever had the privilege of instructing, but he was also principled. He believed in the rules, believed in doing things the right way even when the easy way was more tempting. Hartwell's expression darkened. Reese was different, just as talented, maybe more so in some ways, but he didn't share Nathan's principles. He saw the rules as obstacles to be circumvented, not boundaries to be respected. He wanted to be the best, and he didn't particularly care how he got there. Sarah remembered what Reese had said on the mountain, about adjusting scores and modifying records, about Nathan catching him and filing the report that ended his career. When Nathan discovered that Reese had been falsifying his scores, he faced a choice, Hartwell continued. He could have looked the other way, protected a fellow soldier, kept the peace. A lot of men would have done that. The pressure to stay silent, to not rock the boat, to let small sins slide in the name of unit cohesion, it's enormous. But Nathan didn't do that. He filed a report, documented the evidence, and trusted the system to do the right thing. And the system did, Sarah said. Reese was removed from the program. Yes, and Reese never forgave him for it. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant with memory. I should have watched Reese more closely after that. I should have seen the resentment festering, should have recognized the signs of a man who was nursing a grudge that would eventually consume him. But I was busy, distracted by other responsibilities, and Reese was good at hiding what he really was. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When Nathan was killed, I knew something was wrong. The official report didn't match the man I knew, the soldier I had helped train. Nathan Cross was one of the finest operators I ever had the privilege of working with. The idea that he died because of tactical miscalculation was an insult to his memory and an offense to everything I knew about him. Sarah felt anger stirring in her chest, the familiar rage at a system that protected monsters while good men died. But she held her tongue, letting Hartwell continue. I started investigating quietly, using the contacts I had built up over 30 years in the service. Former students who had risen to positions of influence, friends in intelligence agencies, people who owed me favors or who shared my suspicions about Reese. Hartwell shook his head slowly. Every lead I followed turned into a dead end. Every witness suddenly had nothing to say. Every document was classified or redacted or simply missing. Reese had friends in high places, people who owed him favors or who were complicit in his betrayals. The walls around his secrets were high and thick. But you kept looking, Sarah said. I couldn't stop. Nathan deserved better than a lie on his tombstone, and I suspected even then that Reese was responsible. I just couldn't prove it. Hartwell's voice hardened. Then I heard about you, the contractor who wouldn't stop asking questions, the woman who had been Nathan's partner, who refused to accept the official story, who kept pushing even when every door was slammed in her face. He met her eyes and she saw the respect there, hard-earned and genuine. You reminded me of Nathan. That same stubborn refusal to accept lies. That same unwillingness to let injustice stand even when the whole world told you to move on and forget. I knew then that we were fighting the same fight, even if we didn't know each other existed. You've been watching me, Sarah said. It was not a question. For 2 years, every document you requested, I received a copy through back channels. Every interview you conducted, I had transcripts. Every lead you followed, I followed in parallel, using my access to reach places you couldn't go. Hartwell's expression turned rueful. I should have reached out to you sooner. I should have told you that you weren't alone, that someone else was fighting the same battle. But I was afraid that making contact would alert Reese to my investigation, would give him the warning he needed to cover his tracks even more thoroughly. So I watched from a distance, and I gathered my own evidence, and I waited for the moment when everything would come together. Sarah processed this revelation. For 2 years, she had believed she was fighting alone, that no one else cared about the truth, that the entire military establishment had turned its back on Nathan's memory. And all that time, Hartwell had been working in the shadows, gathering evidence, building a case. The QRF, she said, on the mountain. That wasn't a coincidence. No, Hartwell shook his head. I've had people monitoring Reese's activities for months. When we intercepted communications about an operation in that sector, communications that bore all the hallmarks of his tradecraft, I made sure to be in command of the response force. I positioned my people where they could respond quickly if my suspicions proved correct. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that reminded her why he had been one of the most respected commanders in the sniper community. I didn't know you would be there. That genuinely was a coincidence, though perhaps fate would be a better word. But I knew Reese would be, and I knew that if I could catch him in the act, all those years of quiet investigation would finally bear fruit. What you did on that mountain, Sarah, he continued, what you did for those SEALs, for Dawson, for the mission, it was extraordinary. You broke every rule in the book, abandoned your position, risked your life repeatedly for men who had treated you with nothing but disrespect. And in doing so, you accomplished what I had been trying to do for 3 years. You brought Reese into the open. You made him reveal himself. You gave us the evidence we needed to finally bring him down. Sarah shook her head slightly. I wasn't thinking about that. I was just trying to keep them alive. I know, and that's exactly why what you did matters so much. Hartwell reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. There's something else I need to show you, something we found when we processed Reese's communications. He unfolded the paper and handed it to her. Sarah took it with her good hand, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a transcript, a record of communications between Reese and his handlers, encrypted messages that had been decoded by military intelligence. The dates spanned 3 years, from just before Nathan's death to the present day. And there, in the middle of the transcript, was Nathan's name. Reese didn't just arrange Nathan's death, Hartwell said quietly. He documented it, reported it to his handlers as a success. He was proud of what he had done, proud enough to write it down in messages he thought would never be read by American eyes. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the words. Nathan Cross eliminated. Threat to operation neutralized. No surviving witnesses. The clinical language of murder reduced to bullet points in an intelligence report. But there was more. Details of the ambush that had never appeared in any official document. Confirmation that Nathan had been captured alive, not killed in the initial attack. A reference to 3 days of interrogation before his death. And finally, a single sentence that made Sarah's blood run cold. Subject refused to cooperate despite enhanced techniques. Final words were a name, repeated multiple times, Sarah. She stared at that sentence until the words blurred before her eyes. Nathan's final moments, documented by his murderer. His last breath spent speaking her name, holding on to his faith in her, even as death claimed him. I wanted you to see this, Hartwell said gently. To know that we have proof now. Proof that Nathan was a hero, not a failure. Proof that he died because he discovered the truth and refused to stay silent about it. Proof that the official report was a lie from the first word to the last. Sarah could not speak. The tears came without warning, streaming down her cheeks, dripping onto the hospital blanket. She had cried on the mountain, but those had been tears of grief and exhaustion. These were different. These were tears of vindication, of release, of finally knowing with absolute certainty that everything she had believed about Nathan was true. Hartwell waited in silence, giving her the space to process the enormity of what she had learned. There's one more thing, he said, when her tears finally slowed. Something that was found in your personal effects when they brought you in for surgery. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook, battered and worn, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah recognized it immediately. Nathan's notebook, the one she had carried with her every day since his death. The one that contained his training notes, his observations, his thoughts on wind and distance and all the small details that made the difference between a good shot and a perfect one. The medics found it in your vest pocket, Hartwell said. They thought it was just a field manual at first, but one of them noticed something strange about the binding, a section that was glued together, hidden beneath the back cover. He opened the notebook and carefully peeled back the last page, revealing a folded piece of paper that had been concealed there. Sarah stared at it, her heart suddenly pounding. We didn't read it, Hartwell said. It's addressed to you. Whatever is in there, it was meant for your eyes only. He placed the notebook in her hands and stood. I'll give you some privacy. When you're ready, there's more we need to discuss. About the future, about what comes next. But for now, take as long as you need. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. Nathan was one of the finest soldiers I ever trained. But you, Sarah Morgan, you might be even better. Not because of your skills with a rifle, though those are extraordinary, but because of what's in your heart. The part that wouldn't give up, wouldn't stay silent, wouldn't stop fighting, even when the whole world told you there was nothing left to fight for. He opened the door. That's the rarest thing in the world. Don't ever let anyone take it from you. And then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with a notebook, a hidden letter, and the ghost of the man she had loved. She held the notebook for a long time before she found the courage to unfold the paper. Her hands trembled. Her heart raced. Part of her wanted to know what Nathan had written in his final days. Part of her was terrified of what she might find. In the end, she opened it because not knowing was worse than any truth could be. The letter was written in Nathan's familiar hand, the same neat print she had seen on countless range cards and mission logs. But there was something different about it. Something hurried, almost frantic, as if he had written it quickly, knowing time was running out. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. I'm sorry. I wanted to come home to you more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. But there are some things that matter more than what we want, and this is one of them. I know about Reese. I know what he's been doing, the information he's been passing to our enemies, the men who have died because of his betrayal. I've been gathering evidence, building a case, preparing a report that will expose everything he's done. But I think he knows. I think he suspects that I'm on to him, and I think he's going to do something about it before I can finish. I could walk away. I could pretend I didn't see what I've seen, let someone else deal with the mess, protect myself and hope the problem goes away. But that's not who I am. That's not who you taught me to be. You showed me that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are against you. You showed me that staying silent in the face of injustice is a kind of betrayal all its own. So I'm going to finish this. I'm going to get the evidence I need, and I'm going to expose Reese for what he truly is. And if something goes wrong, if I don't come back, I need you to know some things. First, I love you. I've loved you since the day you humbled me on that rifle range at Benning, when you showed me that my talent meant nothing without wisdom to guide it. Every day since then has been a gift I never deserved, and I will carry the memory of your face with me wherever I go next. Second, I believe in you. I believe that if I fall, you will pick up where I left off. I believe that you won't rest until the truth is known, until justice is done, until the men who did this are held accountable. I believe this because I know you, Sarah Morgan. I know your heart. I know your spirit. I know that you don't know how to quit. Third, don't blame yourself. Whatever happens to me, it won't be your fault. It will be the fault of the men who pulled the triggers, the men who gave the orders, the system that allowed traitors to flourish in positions of power. You couldn't have saved me. No one could have. Some fights are too big for one person, even a person as extraordinary as you. Fourth, live your life. I don't mean forget me. I don't mean move on like I never existed. But don't let my death become a weight that drags you down forever. Find joy where you can. Teach others what you've learned. Build something that matters. The best way to honor my memory isn't to mourn forever. It's to keep doing the work we both believed in. And finally, tell my mother I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I won't be there to take care of her in her old age. Tell her that I thought of her at the end, that her face and yours were the last things I saw in my mind's eye. Tell her that her son died fighting for something that mattered, and that he has no regrets. I have to go now. The helicopter is waiting and there's a mission that needs doing. I don't know if I'll make it back, but I know that whatever happens, I lived a life worth living. I loved a woman worth loving. I fought for something worth fighting for. That's more than most people ever get. Goodbye, Sarah. I'll be waiting for you wherever the road leads next. All my love, forever and always, Nathan. Sarah read the letter 3 times before she could see through her tears. Nathan had known. He had known he might die, had known Reese was on to him, had known the mission might be his last. And he had gone anyway. Not because he wanted to die, but because some things were more important than survival. She pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the paper against her skin, imagining she could feel Nathan's heartbeat in the words he had written. He had believed in her. He had trusted her to continue the fight. He had known even then that she would not rest until the truth was found. And she had not rested through 3 years of dead ends and closed doors, through mockery and dismissal and the crushing weight of institutional indifference. She had kept searching. She had kept fighting. She had kept her promise to him even when she did not know he had made this final gift. 1 month later, Arlington National Cemetery. The November wind carried the last leaves of autumn across the rolling hills of Arlington, past row upon row of white headstones that stood in perfect formation like soldiers on eternal parade. The sky above was the color of brushed steel, heavy with the promise of winter, but occasional shafts of sunlight broke through the clouds to illuminate the graves below like spotlights on a stage that stretched to the horizon. Sarah Morgan walked among the headstones in her dress uniform, the first time she had worn it since leaving the Army 3 years ago. The fabric felt strange against her skin, familiar and foreign at the same time, a reminder of the life she had left behind and the life that was waiting for her to begin. The medals on her chest caught the pale light, small tokens of service that suddenly felt more meaningful than they had in years. Her wounds had healed, at least the physical ones. The shoulder still ached when the weather changed, a deep throbbing that she suspected would be with her for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of the mountain and everything that had happened there. The thigh had mended well, leaving only a scar that would fade with time, but never quite disappear. The deeper wounds, the ones that did not show on the surface, were still healing, but she could feel the progress every day. The weight that had pressed down on her for 3 years was lifting, slowly but surely, as the truth emerged into the light. Reese's court-martial had begun 2 weeks ago. The evidence against him was overwhelming, a mountain of documentation that had taken years to assemble and would take weeks to present. The communications intercepts revealed years of betrayal, contact after contact with enemy handlers, payment after payment for information that had cost American lives. And Webb's testimony filled in the gaps, describing the blackmail and threats that Reese had used to turn him into a tool. The recordings from the mountain captured Reese's own voice, boasting about Nathan's death, revealing details that only the murderer could know. The newspapers had picked up the story. Military traitor exposed. Hero's death avenged. The kind of headlines that captured public attention and drove the machinery of justice forward with irresistible momentum. Nathan's name appeared in nearly every article, always as the victim, always as the hero, always as the soldier whose murder had sparked the investigation that brought Reese down. The official report on his death had been withdrawn, its lies finally acknowledged by the institution that had created them. A new investigation was underway, one that would recognize Nathan for what he was, a soldier who had died fighting against treason, not a failure who had made fatal mistakes. His record was being corrected, his reputation restored, his sacrifice honored at last. The ceremony had begun an hour ago at the cemetery's amphitheater, a formal recognition of Nathan's service that brought together senior military officials, fellow soldiers, and the family members who had waited so long for this moment. Sarah had stood at attention through the speeches, the presentation of posthumous honors, the folding of the flag that would be given to Margaret Cross. She had listened to generals speak words of praise that should have been spoken 3 years ago, had watched the color guard render honors that Nathan had earned with his blood. Now the crowd had dispersed, leaving only a handful of mourners to make the private pilgrimage to Nathan's grave. Sarah walked alone down the path, her footsteps crunching softly on the gravel, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The familiar rows of white headstones stretched out on either side of her, each one marking a life given in service to something larger than any individual, each one a reminder of the price that freedom demanded. She reached Nathan's grave and stopped at the edge, looking down at the headstone that bore his name. The marble was white and clean, inscribed with his name and rank and the dates that bookended his too short life. Someone had placed fresh flowers at its base, red and white and blue, the colors of the flag he had served. And there, newly added, was a small bronze star that marked his posthumous award for valor. She was not alone. Margaret Cross stood beside the grave, dressed in black, her silver hair pulled back in the bun she always wore. In her arms, she held a folded American flag, the one that had been presented to her at the ceremony, the symbol of a nation's gratitude for a sacrifice that could never be repaid. Her face was wet with tears, but there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. "Peace. Thank you for being here," Margaret said, her voice soft but steady. "It means everything to me that you came." Sarah moved to stand beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "I wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world." "I got the letter from the Department of Defense last week," Margaret continued. "The official one saying they're reopening the investigation, that Nathan's record is being corrected, that he's being recognized as a hero who gave his life fighting against treason." Her voice trembled slightly. "After all those years, after all those letters I wrote that no one answered, they're finally telling the truth." "He deserved better," Sarah said. "He deserves so much better than what they gave him. He got better. He got you." Margaret reached out and took Sarah's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her age and grief. "You never gave up on him, Sarah. When everyone else moved on, when everyone else accepted the lies, you kept fighting. You kept searching for the truth even when it cost you everything." Sarah squeezed her hand in return. "He would have done the same for me. He would never have stopped." "No," Margaret agreed. "He wouldn't have. That's the kind of man he was." She paused, looking down at the headstone. "I raised him to be that kind of man, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, to tell the truth even when lies would be easier. I just never thought," her voice broke, "I never thought it would cost him his life." They stood in silence for a long moment, two women united by loss and love, and the stubborn refusal to let the truth be buried. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, the smell of autumn giving way to winter. "I have something for you," Sarah said finally. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "I found this in Nathan's things, hidden in a notebook he left me. I think he wanted you to have it." Margaret unwrapped the paper with trembling fingers, revealing a small silver locket. Inside was a photograph, worn and faded by years of being carried close to someone's heart, showing a young woman holding a baby. "That's me," Margaret whispered. "And Nathan, just a few months old. This was taken the summer after he was born, at the farm in Montana." She clutched the locket to her chest. "He must have taken this from the house years ago. I thought I had lost it forever." "He kept it with him," Sarah said, "through every deployment, every mission, every moment of danger. He wanted a piece of you with him wherever he went." Margaret's tears fell freely now, running down her weathered cheeks, dropping onto the frozen ground. My boy, my beautiful boy. He never stopped being my little Nathan, no matter how far he went or how much he accomplished. Sarah put her arm around the older woman, holding her as she cried. The weight of 3 years of grief and uncertainty came pouring out, released at last by the knowledge that her son had been vindicated, that his sacrifice had not been in vain, that the world finally knew what she had always known, that Nathan Cross was a hero. When Margaret's tears finally slowed, Sarah spoke again. There's something else I need to tell you. Colonel Hartwell, the officer who helped bring Reese to justice, he's offered me a position, a new training program he's developing for operators who have to work in environments where the intelligence has been compromised, where the people they should be able to trust might be the enemy. He wants me to lead it. Margaret looked up at her, her eyes red but clear. Will you take it? I think so. Sarah looked out across the cemetery at the endless rows of white headstones, each one marking a life given in service to something larger than itself. Nathan believed that what we do matters, that every soldier we train, every life we save, every battle we win against people like Reese, it all makes a difference. I want to keep doing that work. I want to teach others what he taught me, what we learned together. He would be proud of you, Margaret said. So proud. You've become everything he believed you could be. Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart. Nathan would be proud. And somewhere, she believed, he knew. He knew that she had kept her promise. He knew that the truth had been found. He knew that his sacrifice had meant something. There's someone I want you to meet, Sarah said. A young man who was on that mountain with me. His name is Kyle Dawson. He reminds me of Nathan in a lot of ways. Talented, arrogant at first, full of potential he didn't know how to use. But he learned. He grew. The mountain taught him things that can't be taught in any school. Another one of your students? I think so, if he'll have me as a teacher. Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had managed in weeks. He's got a lot to learn, but then again, so did Nathan when I first met him. And look how that turned out. Margaret returned the smile, warmth breaking through the grief. You'll take care of him, just like you took care of my Nathan, just like you took care of all of them on that mountain. I'll do my best. That's all any of us can do. They stayed at the grave for another hour, talking quietly about Nathan, sharing memories that made them laugh and cry in equal measure. Sarah told Margaret about the letter she had found, about Nathan's final words, about the love and faith that had sustained him even in his darkest hours. Margaret told Sarah about Nathan as a child, the mischief he had gotten into on the farm, the dreams he had harbored of serving his country, the man he had grown into. When it was finally time to go, Sarah knelt beside the headstone and placed her hand against the cold marble. The green thread she had worn around her wrist for 5 years, the one from their graduation together, she untied it carefully and laid it at the base of the stone beside the flowers in the metal. I kept my promise, she whispered. I found the truth. I made them pay for what they did to you. The wind stirred the thread, making it dance against the white marble. I'm going to keep teaching. Keep training soldiers to be better than they think they can be. Keep fighting against the people who would betray everything we stood for. She paused, feeling the sting of tears, but refusing to let them fall. That's the best way I know to honor you, to keep doing the work we both believed in. She stood and took a step back, looking at the grave one last time. Goodbye, Nathan. I love you. I always will. And I'll see you again someday, wherever the road leads next. Then she turned and walked away, through the rows of white headstones, toward the gate where Kyle Dawson was waiting with a car to take her to the airport. She did not look back. She did not need to. Nathan was not in that grave, not really. He was in her heart, in her memories, in the work she would continue to do for the rest of her life. The sun broke through the clouds as she walked, casting golden light across the cemetery, warming the cold marble of 1,000 headstones. It felt like a blessing, like a sign that somewhere, somehow, Nathan was watching and approving of the path she had chosen. Dawson opened the car door for her as she approached, his face serious but his eyes warm with the respect that had replaced his earlier arrogance. He stood straighter than he had on the mountain, his wounded leg healed enough to bear his weight without assistance. The experience had changed him, broken down the walls of pride and rebuilt them into something stronger, something wiser. Ready? He asked. Sarah looked back one last time at the cemetery, at the rows of white headstones standing like silent sentinels, at the rolling hills where so many heroes lay sleeping their eternal sleep. "Ready," she said. She climbed into the car, and they drove away toward the future Nathan had believed she would build. The sun continued to shine over Arlington, warming the graves of the fallen, honoring their sacrifice with light that would never fade. And somewhere in that light, Sarah knew Nathan Cross was smiling. Because courage does not die with the body. It lives on in the people we inspire, the lessons we teach, the truth we refuse to let be buried. Sarah Morgan, the woman they called Coldsteel, had proven that beyond any doubt. And her story was only beginning. The end.